Monk Radio Network. I'm Gemini, and today is Saturday, July 21st, 2012. We have Alan Abbadessa-Green joining us. Alan is the author of the Sync book, Myths, Magic, Media, and Mindscapes. He is also the creator of the blog, Look at All the Happy Creatures at allthehappycreatures.blogspot.com, as well as the website thesyncbook.com. Alan is currently working on another book connecting the synchronicities of 9/11, bin Laden, and the assassination of JFK. Hello, Alan. Welcome to Time Monk Radio.
Oh, thank you so much. Wonderful to be here.
The executive producer is Fox, and he will be doing the recording and technical support of the show. Several members of the Time Monk Forum were kind enough to join us this evening. Please welcome members Chipperdog, Green Meadow, and Uranus Rising. This interview will be available for free on YouTube, the Time Monk Radio Facebook page, and at the website timemonkradio.com. Alan, we have several topics that we would like to delve into this evening. Let's start with your background and how synchromysticism became a part of your life.
Sure, thank you. I guess I had somewhere in after post 9/11, as probably many of us start to just question what's happening. I will admit right up front that I was somewhat ignorant to a lot of world events before that. There was really a big moment for me of questioning, seeing sort of essentially a political coup, or bear in mind I live in New York, so it's just something I sort of had a front row seat to, and really saw for the first of my life, here's men with machine guns on the corner and in the subway, and what the hell is going on here? So I guess I got really into conspiracy research, and I did that for a number of years, and every now and then I'd sort of bump into someone who there was this overlap between conspiracy research and what people were calling synchromysticism, and it was making similar sort of connections of noticing how events sort of played together, but without putting a direct causality on it, without assuming that this is because someone planned it this way or this is proof of a conspiracy, but that it just seemed to be a sort of expression of how the universe either self-organized or some sort of other structuring principle. And it was really interesting to me because it just filled in a lot of gaps and answered a lot of questions that I had as far as seeing people doing conspiracy research. And you'd always have this kind of knee-jerk reaction to a lot of phrases that I guess I felt uncomfortable with. People saying, look, here's some expression of as above, so below, therefore this is conspiracy. Oh, look, this is what the elite believe. And I thought to myself, but that really, I don't know that makes you part of a conspiracy. That seems to be that you're observing reality. There does seem to be a very much a sort of principle in reality, not just politics or anything like that, that does seem to have this reflection. And I guess this, like I said, this sort of filled in a lot of gaps for me of saying, okay, well, those things that I always thought were kind of strange and that I wasn't quite comfortable just accepting that was proof of a conspiracy, it gave me another option, another way of looking at things. And once I started getting to this research and really opening myself up to this possibility that it wasn't, and again, this is not exclusive of control and conspiracies. Obviously, there are very real things that are done that are very, very gruesome and very planned and explicit, but not everything. And just in the act of opening myself up to this and sort of realizing, hey, all these things that happened to me in my life, and particularly as someone I think who, bear in mind, I've written fiction for many years, just something I've just always enjoyed doing. And there's a story that I wrote probably in 1998, thereabouts, that has a lot of strange synchronicities with 9/11. And I'm not, saying I predicted it. I'm saying that there was really strong overlap there. And then when you see people going, hey, look at Neo's passport says 9/11/2001, or that famous album art. If anyone's ever seen the Coup party music album cover, where the guys are like blowing up the twin towers on the album cover, and it's just all these sort of things that a lot of people put as say, look, this is proof of predictive programming. This is someone intentionally put this out there so that you would swallow the lie of 9/11 easier. And it occurred to me that if anyone had read the story I wrote in 1998, they would accuse me of the same thing. But I can't speak for anyone else. I can't speak for the guys who made Matrix movies, or I can't speak for Coup Party music, but I can certainly speak for myself. And I know I had no hand in 9/11. Um, so it just sort of, once I saw how, wait a second, my artwork has this resonance and this strange overlap between life imitating art, art imitating life, however you want to take that. Um, it just, again, it just sort of opened up a whole new area for me, and it's something that remains absolutely fascinating to me. We can get into some of the stuff deeper, but that's really, I would say, my entrance point was that.
Thank you. So, Alan, how would you define synchronicity and synchromysticism then?
Probably the best, most basic synchronicity definition, I think, is meaningful coincidences. Um, there's some people take it as having esoteric symbolism, or other people have put different criteria on it. But I think the best, most simple explanation is meaningful coincidences. But that in itself, there's sort of a question embedded in the answer, is who attributes meaning to it. So this is where we get some highly personal answers. Well, a coincidence that might be meaningful to me might not be meaningful to you. So what synchromysticism does starts to explore that realm. So this is where we get into areas of expanded consciousness, perhaps metaphysics, esoteric symbolism, all these different things to show, hey, this is something that people have thought meaningful for many years, or maybe there's already a system in place that recognizes the meaning here. So that's one aspect to consider. And then when you consider that it's something that's highly meaningful to me that isn't meaningful to you, just the questions that raises. And this is essentially what we're doing, is exploring, in my opinion, what we're doing is exploring that personal and interpersonal realm of the meaningfulness. The guy who really coined the phrase synchromysticism, Jake Kotza, uh, he described for him, this was more studying pop culture, looking at movies, music, TV shows, and looking for esoteric symbolism and synchronicities between the different shows. So, like, something that they do that's really that they really focus on is, say, a movie actor. I don't know, Jim Carrey. Jim Carrey has been the Grinch, where he has green skin, and then he's the Riddler in Batman, where he's got the green skin. He's in The Mask, where he's got the green skin. And you start to, what they would create, these sort of composite characters, and show that throughout one actor's career, there seems to be a sort of mythological resonance. And in this case, probably Osiris. Was a green-skinned Egyptian deity. So you start seeing, even in the films where Jim Carrey doesn't have green skin, does his role resonate with Osiris or these other mythological themes? And for them, it was very much a focus on pop culture, and that's very important to them. For me, I'm less interested in pop culture. I enjoy movies time to time, but I absolutely despise television. I haven't watched TV in years. Every now and then I go to someone's house and catch a TV show, and I find it pretty appalling. um, but just to say, with their recognition of what I think there's immense value in what they're doing. In my opinion, there's no doubt that there's a science to what they're doing, and they're able to sort of find that silver lining. It could be absolutely terrible TV show or a terrible movie, but they're able to pick out the sort of juicy bits and the things that seem to resonate universally, and maybe that adds that adds something that we can find value in, even if the TV show is terrible. Just to say is I don't think the pop culture aspect, even though that was sort of how it was first defined, I think the study has gotten much wider than pop culture. So I would sort of lean towards that wider definition than its original definition.
Okay. And I listened to an interview that you did while back, it's probably about a year ago, and you were discussing how a higher intelligence responds to us through synchronicities. Do you still feel this way? And is this an intelligence that's always there attempting to get our attention?
Yeah, I think ultimately all right. I was just having a conversation last night or the night before with a gentleman, William Morgan, who he was in the Sync book. He's one of the co-hosts of a radio show, 42 Minutes. He does a blog called A Few Shots to Shaman.blogspot.com. An awesome guy. And we were sort of having this conversation based on a incredibly powerful series of synchronicities I had last week. And I was discussing with him because I just sort of needed to talk to someone about it. It was so specific that it seemed as if it was a specific intelligence. And yet, one of the things synchronicity shows us is that everything is sort of a reflection of inner and outer. Um, some people take this to be very solipsistic. Oh, everything in my external reality is merely a projection of myself. Well, that's true to an extent, but it's more of a mirror. So, when we were discussing, I said there was this very, very specific sort of mythological figure that just almost like pounding me over the head throughout the day, and I didn't even really realize it till later in the day. And then I just looked back and I was like, oh my God, it's almost as if there was some being, let's say, waving their hand and going, hello, I'm here. And yet I'm reluctant to fully say that. Just for a number of reasons, I'm reluctant to take that viewpoint. Again, is this a reflection of opening up a higher consciousness in ourselves? Or is it an external contact experience? And we were having this conversation, and he sort of asked me that question. I said, well, I think it's both. I think it sounds like a paradox, but it really seems like it's both. There is, of course, just as, you might take from a one perspective, we're all one. Now, there's what, 6, 7 people on this phone call right now, and in one sense, we are all one higher consciousness. And yet, we don't deny the individual. We don't deny that there's a difference between each of us. It's what makes us special. So ultimately, it's both. If that answers your question.
It does. And then I'm curious to know if you find that when you start noticing synchronicities that they increase in frequency and intensity for you.
Absolutely. That's the thing is throughout my life, we've all had meaningful coincidences, things that we question, go, but we usually just sort of write it off as, that's so weird, and then you kind of move on with your day. I definitely noticed a few years ago when I got into this, just by the act of paying attention to it, how much it sort of amplified the experience and the frequency, um, to the point where I know experiences that I have on a daily basis, had I had those experiences a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, sometimes even a week ago, I might have just thought it was so bizarre. And it's sort of gotten to the point where this is normal for me.
Okay. Yeah, I experienced the same thing. And we have a question next from Uranus Rising.
Hi, Alan. I was curious about something. I read your book quite a while ago after I heard an interview that you did, and I was really intrigued by it. Synchromysticism appeared when I first read the book like it had grown out of younger generations than myself, and especially in urban environment. And you talked already about its origins maybe arising out of pop culture. Is this a welcomed modern urban interpretation of mythology?
Sure, I think modern interpretation mythology and perhaps even shamanism, you know,
Mm,
we if we if we lived a few thousand years ago and we lived somewhere in the jungles and someone was reading patterns in a tree bark, we would call that person a shaman. Now, someone walking down the street sees patterns in a movie poster, and we call that person a synchromistic. I
yeah,
think ultimately what we're doing is something that's probably very, very old. It's
yeah,
just, I think some people have, and probably rightfully so, people have some reluctance to this because they see anything that's media, anything that's particularly something urban or something pop culture. It all comes with this notion that it's very highly controlled. You know, it's
mm,
this is something that's been discussed in boardrooms and God knows where. Is it propaganda? Is it or just clever marketing? But it just seems so controlled that people have a reluctance to accept this as valid. Let's say this year, what did they come out with? Like 4 Snow White movies. Is that a
mhm.
synchronicity, or is that some marketers going, "Hey, we can hop on this bandwagon and maybe try and if we can build a buzz around Snow White, all our movies will be successful." Well, again, the answer is both. Obviously, these guys sitting in boardrooms thought this out, and
Yeah,
yet when it emerges into as it's emerging into the timeline, this is still an expression of a sort of higher, wider consciousness and a moment in time, if that makes sense. So it's yes, this is very intentional and controlled that there's 4 Snow White movies, yet it's still in another way is influenced by something in our current timeline that has a resonance with that mythology at the moment.
and you mentioned something very old, and I wonder if it's sort of, I think of it as tuning our radio to certain channels
Mm.
now, whether it's pop culture or, in my case, nature, sometimes relationships or whatever. But are all of these attuning, are they sort of avenues of reflections back to us, sort of the portals between ourselves, cross boundaries, time, space, and these connections between things and events? And is it about going back to that ability that maybe we've lost in our recovering?
Yeah, the short answer is yeah, absolutely. I really feel that again, we raised the question of were primitive societies, what we call primitive societies, were they more in tune with the forces of nature or each other? This is a sort of Terence McKenna archaic revival. We can go down all these sort of roads. Um, but ultimately, I think this is something that people have been interacting with for probably since time immemorial. I don't know if there was ever a point where there wasn't someone not interacting with it. We just might have periods of forgetting, periods where it becomes sort of taboo. Um, certainly with modern Western reductionism,
Mm,
where there's a reluctance to these kinds of thinking, which is why we call these societies primitive. Were they actually? They seem pretty
well,
advanced to me.
yes,
Uh,
just
so,
not so materialistic focused.
right. And we see this across this is when you mention mythology. I mean, this is the interesting thing is we see how really there's a crossover between synchromysticism and comparative mythology, because what you're seeing is that every culture across the globe had very similar stories. Now, that might be cause for, you know, uh, extraterrestrial activity. We could, there are people who say, okay, look, this tribe said beings from the stars came down and taught us how to farm, and then this other culture says being from the stars came down and taught us how to farm. So
Yeah.
there's a possibility that it's just very literal, and yet
Yeah.
there's also the possibility that um, there's cases of literal and also cases of metaphor where they're interacting with the same thing, where one
Mm.
culture might call it the Akashic record, one culture might call it something else, and we have the noosphere, we have all these different terms for it, but ultimately, a lot of cultures probably didn't even have a name for it. Like, it's funny. I saw someone post just a stupid little thing on Facebook that really made me laugh. Was they said something like "eat organic food," or as our grandparents called it, "food." Which I thought was really funny in one respect, and really true, and yet we can apply that same little joke to this. It's like, well, this culture might not have had a name for it because that was just normal to them. Of course, you go to the Amazon. It's like, of course we can speak to the cosmic serpents. Yeah, like we don't have a name for it. It's just, yeah, it's that. It's normal. Uh,
Yes.
so that's the other tricky part. Is like, now we're trying to come up with a name for it. Well, we don't see this culture mentioning it. Maybe they didn't mention it because there was no need to. It was only after we've completely forgotten about it and it becomes something strange that we feel the need to label it or something.
Yeah. Do you have any idea why we forgot about it?
Well, that's a big question. Obviously you have aspects of control. So there again, you could have a very human-handed control element. We see how many cultures had their books burned and their priests killed, and
Mm.
um, you make substances illegal. Um, there's I don't know if you've ever read Terence McKenna's Food of the Gods. Um, he sort of makes this case for a number of factors where you have just sort of the lifestyle of the peoples, as it goes out of the fields where they would be with cow patties and where magic mushrooms would grow.
Mhm.
So you have this progression. So the people who are living in the jungles, the early peoples in the jungles, aren't finding cow dung with mushrooms in it, and then suddenly they find magic mushrooms and cow dung once they've moved into that territory, and now suddenly you have that rise. And then with a culture of industrialization, you sort of lose some of that. Again, it's just a contact with these substances. And I don't mean to put everything on psychedelics. I just think that's a good example of how our lifestyle can reflect it.
Yeah.
And I think even with there's an obvious reason to have mixed feelings about our current technological state, where it's both
Mhm.
frightening and exciting that we can just right now. There's six of us on a strange magical device that allows us to communicate. Um, there's a wonderful thing about it, and then you obviously have where we're losing privacy and just all the whole slew of downsides to it. But that being said, while I very much want to put the caveat that there are downsides to it, as there are to psychedelics, no doubt,
Mhm.
um, at the same time, we sort of find ourselves perhaps now engaging with something that can be related the same way that when these people first encountered psychedelic plants, it opened them up to aspects of telepathy and language and communication on an unbefore known level. Perhaps now that we have all these devices that allow us to communicate, we can kind of tap into that again in a very similar way.
Yes. Oh, what? Yeah. Thank you, Alan. Great.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Hi, Alan. This is Green Meadow. So I have a question of, as synchronicity is, I guess, rising to the surface in some way and more people are being drawn to it, um, how do we use it? What's it useful for? Does it give us shortcuts? Is it sending us messages? How do you use synchronicity?
That's a question that gets asked a lot, particularly within this community. So we're all studying it, and then every now and then we all sort of say, "Wait a second, is this useful at all?" And I have to admit, right up front, there are moments where we all have our. I've spoken to so many people, and we go every now and then. There's that moment of, "Wait a second." I just think it's a really fair question and a really debated series of answers. That's why I just sort of put that out there because, when I just to quickly say, the reason I did the sync book as 26 authors and not, hey, this is Alan writing a book about synchronicity, is because there are so many interpretations. So I just sort of need to throw that out there, that there are a slew of answers that could be given here. But ultimately, for myself, the most basic way that it's useful is that if we bring it back to the idea of meaningful coincidences and why is it meaningful, it sort of gives you a really good peek, a window into yourself. So when you realize, hey, I'm really interested, so for the guy who's really interested in Jim Carrey, maybe after wondering, just sort of noticing all this stuff about Jim Carrey for a year, maybe he takes a step back and goes, oh my God, so I was fascinated with these aspects of his film career. That shows something about myself, that I have an inclination to find these things meaningful. Does that make sense? It's sort of like a window into yourself, into your mind, and your subconscious realms. So I think that's, in one way, probably the most obvious, useful tool here.
That makes sense. Yeah, they seem like signposts, but it's like signposts in,
yeah.
yet where?
So definitely, I mean, these are, and that's what you're saying there. So there's a possibility that there's a secondary or perhaps many other uses. But if we take back into account this sort of perhaps external element, where it's not just all a solipsistic, it's all me viewpoint. If we add that onto it, then there's possibility that it's really has applications for other things. Just to go back to McKenna a second, he made the argument that about sort of time travel, that if someone were to ever build a time machine, you would have to understand some of these concepts. And it's funny because I had Andras Jones, one of the other authors, I was talking to him, and he mentions the same thing, that whether it's literal time travel or entering a realm where time is not as linear as we expect it to be, which would ultimately, synchronicity is a temporal phenomenon, right? If we're noticing, hey, that these 5 events all are sort of happening at the same time with a common theme, and that seems to reflect, the conversation I had at breakfast this morning. This is a temporal phenomenon. These are events that are occurring within time, often seemingly unrelated out of time. So, I walk past the TV and my wife's watching a movie from 1963 that has a synchronicity with what I was saying for, today, and then so on, so on, so on. And then there's a commercial for something brand new, which also syncs with it. And I hate to give the pop culture examples, but just to say something like that. So ultimately, we see where something very old could interact with something very new, and just all. Or you're walking down the street and you're talking about, I don't know, pick a word, bluebells. We're talking about bluebells, and then you walk past, you turn the corner and there's a store called Bluebells Florist or something. So it's a temporal phenomenon. You're interacting with something that was at a precognition, or just that these two seeming coincidences occurred coincidentally, right? They're occurring together. So when we start to realize time isn't perhaps as linear as we expect it to be, or as we're always taught that it is, this recognizing synchronicity and studying synchromysticism, I do believe, is a sort of mental or psychic training for a better exploration of time. Just as we might have certain training we'd go through if we're going to become explorers studying the bottom of the ocean. Well, if we're going to study psychedelic landscapes, and with or without actual psychedelics, I think this conversation is psychedelic. We're we're a bunch of people sharing our thoughts. Regular conversation is psychedelic. We really step back and go, what are we doing? So I just want to say, it's like, using that expression, a psychedelic landscape could be through meditation, could be through yoga, through the internet, through watching a movie, whatever your chosen method is for exploring mindscapes, um, and exploring time, and exploring higher realms of consciousness. This is excellent training for understanding how archetypes and forces, and perhaps external forces, internal forces, how all these things sort of come together and how to navigate them. So I sometimes think like we're building we're like map makers. We're sort of mapping a landscape that isn't necessarily physical and tangible, but is incredibly real nonetheless. So I think it's a little more of an abstract answer, but I think that's another use for this.
Yeah, and I liked your discussion of time with synchronicity, because that seems like a very strong part to understanding synchronicity. Um, because like I see artists or novelists, well, like yourself even, but like Robert Heinlein accessed for some reason all kinds of things about the future that were accurate.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And how do artists have that window? Or is there something about being an artist that gives them that window? Um, that in that
If
artistic place that you can find things accidentally and then they show up.
Right. And to say that was like really my biggest earliest question, is seeing all these people who say it's obviously predictive programming, and I don't doubt there could be cases of that, but to me that's not the really interesting phenomenon here. What you're saying, that's the really interesting thing. Things that someone would have no motivation to plan. There's like that the old book. There was like a book called like The Wreck of the Titan, which, when the Titanic sank, it's like the book almost details it plot point for plot point. Um, that's not an age of technology. That's not an age of there. You couldn't. I don't really think you could argue why that would be predictive programming, or what would be the advantage of some Mr. Burns twiddling his fingers and putting this book out there. It just really doesn't make sense. Yet it happens. So when you say about an artist, that's you're really seem to be tapping into the big point here, is that an artist speaks very often in metaphor. And an artist, if it's a visual artist, they might use actual archetypes or sacred geometry without even being necessarily aware of sacred geometry, just basic geometry that they're putting together in a way that makes sense to them, or they're expressing an emotion through visual cues and through colors, and this seems to work. If you're a writer, then you're going to use metaphor and poetic language. You're essentially accessing this field, which is a field that's made up of archetypes, a field that is made up of our subconscious, perhaps our collective unconscious. So when the artist taps into it, that seems to be the answer as to why they're able to do this. So if we realize, wow, there's immense value, it's sort of that like left brain, right brain type thing. If we realize there's immense value in exploring this field, exploring our right brain, exploring our subconscious. If we understand that, then again, perhaps we start to understand how it works a little better. Obviously, most artists aren't setting out to predict the future. They're setting out to tell a story or to paint a beautiful picture. And yet they're having this sort of what we might consider a side effect. So if we go, hey, that's the side effect of doing this, what if we actually plunge in and explore what exactly is this that they are tapping into? I want to say that with the caveat that, I think perhaps the greatest use for any of this stuff might be artistic expression. We could put all the things on there that it could lead to scientific discovery, and I honestly believe that, and personal growth, and psychological development, and so on, so on, so on. And yet, I love artwork, and if this is what people are using it for, and they're able to create something so beautiful, well, then that's equally amazing to me. If you know what I mean?
Yeah. And just as you're talking, it's making sense that, they can't have all this control, and the synchronicity actually takes power out of their hands, and the syncs gives us power back in a way.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Our imagination is we're imagining the world to be, and whoever they are, can't really control that.
Correct. And I know there might be someone listening who would argue that point. I've had people argue that point with me. But I think ultimately, a Hollywood movie studio can control and say, well, we're going to censor this statement, or you can't, we want you to take this scene out, or there are ways for them to limit. And yet, I'll tell you, in something I talk about is, if the guy who's creating a fiction story, whether it be about a boat sinking, or whatever his fiction story is, if that story, which is fiction, has all these strange unintentional elements in it, what's to say that the guy who, even the evil guy who's writing propaganda, and the politician who's getting up in front of the TV and telling a bunch of lies, well, that's fiction, right? Now, wouldn't his fiction still be subject to these unintentional forces that the guy who's writing the book about the boat sinking, that his fiction was subject to? I can't see how, a guy writing, let me tell you, I've written a novel. It's a fairly left brain endeavor. It's like you have to really structure your thing, and there's a lot of quote unquote control elements in it. You're trying to control what you're doing, and yet you can't help but turn around and go, oh my God, how did all this other stuff sneak in there? So the guy who's trying to control his political message, the guy who's trying to, sell you deodorants and, Coca-Cola, I have no doubt that his fiction is subject to the same forces.
Yeah, that makes sense.
That's really interesting, Alan, that you say that, because it's, that sounds like then we're all participants in a larger field than we're aware of. And if it is given meaning, then it can be functional for us.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, precisely.
I've got a question from a member, Alan Moore. Is it possible to increase our receptivity to synchronicity through meditation, yoga, or similar disciplines?
Yeah, I think that, that might be the point of those disciplines, and not, both synchronicity and sort of related phenomena, excuse me. Ultimately, what are you trying to do? You're trying to, if you're trying to do yoga, let's we could be explicit here. We could say you're trying to raise your kundalini. We can get into like some specific practices. Now, in a sense, this is a personal thing. So we see the interplay between the very personal practice of manipulating your body, and you're meditating and you're doing these poses, and then this connection to something that's not personal, to something that's bigger than yourself. So
Right.
ultimately, in that sense, I think the answer is yes. Whether or not someone's trying to increase synchronicities in their life, or just trying to tap into this, again, for lack of a better term, this sort of universal field, well, then I think the answer is very much yes.
Right, right. Well, I can see how, following a yogic path of stilling the mind chatter would help in being able to spot these connections that were available as synchronicities.
Absolutely, yeah. And if I may just sort of back up for a moment, and someone was saying with the idea of like taking the personal power, some of the personal power back. This again, when you say spotting, if we're sort of recognizing archetypes and symbolism and synchronicities, and we're placing the meaning, it is very much an empowering thing because, uh, sort of a cliche example, but the swastika. The swastika is a much older symbol than Hitler.
Oh, right.
And it has very positive connotations for many people for many years. And then Hitler comes along and he's a douchebag and he puts his symbol on everything, and then people go, wow, that's an evil symbol.
Oh,
Well,
what a douchebag symbol.
right. Can a symbol be evil? I would argue no. The symbol is amoral. The symbol doesn't have doesn't have an agenda. People
Right.
use it. People might use it with an agenda, but then, so forevermore we're allowing Hitler to define a universal archetype. To me, that's very disempowering. And then
Right.
we have this same kind of thing when we see, I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with conspiracy research, when people say, oh, look at this symbol. This is a symbol of Luciferians, or this is a symbol of the Illuminati or Freemasons or whatever. And they're saying, therefore, this is an evil symbol. It's all bad. And to me, that's just as disempowering as letting Hitler define your symbol, as letting even someone well-intentioned, it could be someone very, very well-intentioned.
We end up giving away your power.
Yeah. Right. The symbol doesn't belong to the Freemasons or the Illuminati or to Hitler. The symbol doesn't belong to anybody. That's my point. So and then ultimately, if you place importance on your personal, when we say the meaningful, that's personally defined, that's very empowering, because then you get to reclaim your connection to these archetypes, these symbols, and you don't let anyone else define it for you. Let Coca-Cola smack something on their can if they want. It's I would prefer I guess I'd prefer they not, but honestly, what does it have to do with me? If you understand that they don't define it, if you don't let them define it, let them put it wherever, do whatever you want with it.
Well, it's really refreshing to hear you intimate that the elite aren't behind every symbolic representation of every tree out there. That mindset makes for an intolerably intolerant version of the abstraction called forest. I've got another question from Alan. And he says that you write, synchромysticism explores this phenomena, the interpenetration of all things, and seeks to increase the ability to recognize relationships by relaxing the rigid conceptualization of the world. In many ways, this goal seems in sync, pardon the expression, with one of the goals of Buddhist meditation, to cut through useless concepts to discover the now. Could you discuss this rigid conceptualization and how it cripples us in seeing a deeper reality? And I have almost the same thought that I had written down earlier without seeing what Alan wrote. And it's, can you speak to how you found to be a reliable method for shedding the dreck that has been built on top of the underlying basis these symbols represent, and we pull our meanings from in order to have a better view of it?
Sure. Just to clarify, that quote is actually a quote from Jake Coetzee. I didn't write that.
Okay.
So, but I thought that quote was really a really beautiful description of what we're doing. So that
Right.
quote I essentially put at the front of the book, but that's not. I just want to say that's Jake's quote.
Yeah.
But yeah, ultimately, it kind of goes back to that same thing we were just talking about, the rigid conceptualization. These are sort of, knee-jerk reactions we have that we're sort of throughout life, whether it's school or our parents or advertisers or even life experiences, where we sort of, let me give you like a kind of silly, but I think a commonly enough relatable example.
Yeah.
I remember, I was in college and I went to some party. I really don't even drink anymore, but I went to this party in college, and I showed up late, and most of the drinks were gone, and all that was left was cranberry and vodka. And so I kept drinking and drinking and drinking until I got very sick. And then for the next 2 years, it was like, I didn't even want to think about a cranberry or vodka. It's like,
Yeah.
so we
Right.
have our experience sort of defines for us something that was neutral before. Now suddenly it's bad. And
Right.
sometimes this is a healthy survival technique. I actually, in one respect, think modern human beings, are kind of lacking in this. I remember, researching, it was like, an animal in nature, if they eat a food and that food makes them sick, they won't eat that food anymore. Human beings, they'll go to
Right.
McDonald's every day, So in one respect, we could learn this as a nice survival technique, but taking it as a metaphor nonetheless, um, you know, there's nothing wrong with cranberries. It
Right.
was just in my experience, I suddenly had a sort of predisposition towards cranberries equal bad.
Yep.
And throughout life, people have different experiences where, whether it's a symbol becomes bad, or just, again, these sort of, you know, uh, associations, mental associations that are very fast. It's like, I, I say black, you say white. It's like
Yeah.
that sort of, okay, what's the first word that pops to your mind? So we have these preconceived notions that I would argue is the rigid conceptualization of the world. You can actually take that much further, and the rigid conceptualization of the world is, I touch this chair and I call it chair.
Right.
Well, who's I don't want to become like totally out there. I think, again, it's important to state, yeah, this is a chair. Right now it's holding me up pretty well, and I'm thankful for it. Um, but uh, but nonetheless, this is a rigid conceptualization. Is that all these words and things that we're taught and that we just take on, and for the most part, we never even think about. And
Right.
this is a way that advertisers and manipulative politicians can certainly abuse us. So there is that as well. So this is a reason to like kind of deprogram. But ultimately, when you deprogram, you start to realize, well, wait, if you put a question mark on everything and say, let me start over, and without other people telling me what is this,
Make your own meaning.
make your own meaning. And this might be a sort of, woo woo example, but like if you suddenly took everything you've ever learned out of your mind and and you had the eyes of a child again, this chair would be pretty strange. And I'm not saying we should all just shut our minds off. Obviously, I'm just to say that if you can, I think the skill is to shut your mind off, and then, and kind of bring it, the chatter, to bring it back, and and so there's a use for the ego. There's a lot of people who say kill the ego, kill the ego.
Right.
There's a use for that, the ego, and there's a use for killing it. There's a use for quieting it and putting it in its perspective. So every now and then, I think it's helpful to take those rigid conceptualizations out, and instead of going, well, wait a second, I'm told that this, this is a chair, or this movie, we say, or this is a tree, or this is whatever, that some conspiracy website told me that this is predictive programming, or my friend told me this is a great movie. Maybe the movie sucks.
Right.
Let's stop taking all the other conceptions out, and even the ones we ourselves put on, which is why I gave that cranberry vodka example. It's like, even the ones we imprint our own minds with, At some point, I have to say, well, wait a second, cranberries aren't bad. They're actually delicious, and cranberries are
Right.
good for you. And, maybe you just shouldn't mix them with vodka and drink too much. That's, this is a life lesson, but let's just take a step back and go, I programmed myself with the idea that this equals this, and maybe by stepping back, I can learn something really valuable from it.
Right. Like the tendency to program myself.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Thank you, Alan.
No, thank you.
Yeah, hi, Alan. It's Green Meadow again. I have another question on symbolism. What do you think of the Illuminati cards? Many of the cards have depict images that have come to pass, like the terrorist bombing of the Twin Towers, bombing of the Pentagon. They have a image of a cormorant in oil, which was actually a photograph that was later produced. And the cards were created in 1995. So what do you think is going on there?
That's an excellent question. I don't think I don't think anyone can really answer that. I guess if anyone could answer, it would be the guy who actually made the cards. Um, I'm open to both possibilities. It could be, it could be predictive programming. It could be somebody. Let's not even say both possibilities. Why limit ourselves to two? Um, we have to be open to the idea that perhaps this is a guy who's into conspiracy research. Bear in mind, the cards came out in 1995. That's after the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. We've had political assassinations. We've seen how, I know there's like things in the card where they basically, I don't remember what the expression they use on it, but we were basically co-opting political movements. These are techniques that someone was probably very aware of. So is that a really educated guess? Do you know what I mean? Is that like someone saying, well, they've done this, it's very likely they could do so on, so on, so on. And is that just a really educated guess and that's why it's correct? Is it actually predictive programming, or is it synchronicity? I don't think anyone can honestly answer that question.
Yeah, it's just that some of them are so I can see
yeah.
the educated guess kind of thing, but when you get images like the bird in oil and then that photograph appears everywhere, it's like, wow, how did they pull that image out? And maybe it's just a, wake up that synchronicity exists.
But right now, so I mentioned earlier coup party music. Do you know what I'm referring to?
I don't know them.
I'll be honest, I don't know the band either. Let me just, if everyone takes a second, if possible, Google COUP party, PARTY music, coup party music, and just Google whatever your preferred search engine, and look for images. I think you're going to see a perfect example of, wow, that's incredibly exact. We're not talking like that's kind of similar. We're talking about, wow, that is exact. So let me know if you pull that image up. I mean, this was an album. Bear in mind, if I'm not mistaken, this album was actually set to go to the printers. The artwork was supposed to go to the printers on September 11th. They actually had to call the printers and make them stop so that this didn't go out. It's an image.
That's just bizarre. Yeah.
Yeah. So now
and for our listeners, it's looking up at the way the clouds would come out of the Twin Towers after they got bombed.
Yeah, it's the Twin Towers exploding, but around the area where the planes, or whatever your preferred explanation for what hit those towers, but it's an image very, very much that we saw, almost an exact image. Now and then, like I said, when we say synchronicity is a temporal phenomenon, it's the eerie coincidence is, I think, amplified by the fact that it was so close to the moment. So, you gave the example of the bird in oil. If that photo of the bird taken in oil was the same day that the Illuminati cards came out, And I'm not saying that, again, I'm not saying that that's not a valid, what you point out is not a valid synchronicity. That's not my point here. As I'm saying, when we see something so specific, yeah, it gets confusing. And I'd be, if I can be straight honest here, I get really upset when people answer those kind of questions definitively. To say, I know it's predictive programming, or I know it's synchronicity. No, I don't know. This is a really excellent question. All I'm saying is I've seen weirder things that I'm open to the possibility that's just straight up synchronicity, or a very educated guess. That doesn't mean we don't. I think what we're all kind of learning to do is to combine areas of research and areas of understanding. So there's something important to be knowing to be aware that there is political conspiracies are real. So someone, whether you think that's bin Laden, which I do not, but if you think it's bin Laden or George Bush or the Illuminati or whomever, whatever you think it is, there's a real value in researching those types of, causal, just to back up, synchronicity, Carl Jung defines synchronicity as an acausal principle, meaning, it's not cause and effect. It's not like I do this, then this happens. It's that these two things are seemingly unrelated, or seemingly not, are related, but not by cause and effect. So that doesn't mean that causality stops. And this is something that I kind of, this is, I guess, this is a personal standpoint, but this is something I kind of confront from time to time. People who are taking this as, to the other extreme. You either have someone who says it's all causality, and if you see this symbolism, then obviously it's controlled by, the Bilderberg group or the Illuminati. And then you have the other extreme where someone says, no, this is all just, it's all just happening. Well, causality does not go out the window. So again, the answer is both. And I hope that it doesn't come out as a cop out. Like, I really mean that. The answer is both. That yes, somebody chose to take those towers down. Without a doubt. That didn't just happen. It's not like, magic, some guy sneezed somewhere in India and, ooh, these buildings fell over. Someone did that. There's causality. And yet, it seems to resonate with all these other things in ways that are not causally intended. So when we say the Illuminati cards, or any example we want to use, we have to be open to the possibility, and we should be aware that there are such things as conspiracies, and these things are all very, very, very real, and that there's causality, and there's intentional people trying to manipulate you. And yet, if we go one way too far on either side of that, I think we're missing out. So if anything, what a lot of us are learning to do, and I think probably everyone in this conversation, and probably everyone listening to this conversation, we're all in the process of doing this together. There's a lot of people that come on interviews and they say they got it all figured out, and everyone wants to be like they got the next answer. But we're all kind of figuring this out together. And what I think we're learning is that, hey, if I take some of this guy's knowledge, and I take some of this knowledge, and I take some of this knowledge, and your personal experiences, and you this is how you build some sort of wisdom with which to make, decisions as to what either, what has meaning to you, or what do you think is the proper action to be taken. If I thought that the Illuminati controlled everything and every synchronicity that I had in my daily life, I guess my reaction would be, I don't know, to hide under a rock or something. How crazy must that make somebody? And yet, if you just think everything's wonderful, this is meant to be, and the IRS man knocks on your door and says, hey, we want you to give us all your money, and guess what? We want you to put on this uniform and go kill a bunch of brown people in another country, and hey, we want this and we want this. and you think it's all a message from God or from the universe or whatever, and everything's just, go along to get along, I don't think that's appropriate either. So I think we have to have this sort of piece together an understanding, and this is just all of us trying to kind of understand the full detail of what we're doing. This is I refer to this as a kaleidoscopic lens. You're taking pieces from each little bit of understanding, and if you apply it, if you learn to sort of integrate these different understandings, where hey, yeah, there is conspiracy, and hey, yeah, there's synchronicity, and hey, yeah, this guy could just have made an educated guess, and hey, yeah, it doesn't muddy the waters. It's not like I'm not trying to say these things to make it any more muddy than it already is. There's enough confusion going on. I'm not saying it for that reason. I'm saying it because we have to come at it with the understanding that, hey, these are all possibilities, and then it's up to me to use my reason and my intuition and everything that I've learned along the way to make up my own mind about it. And I would always hesitate to define it for somebody else. I think that's just as disempowering as what we're fighting against.
Yeah. I appreciate your answer very much. I think there's a lot more to be gained to be living in the question versus being lived in any particular fixed answer. So I really appreciate your response. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Green Meadow. We are speaking with Alan Abbadessa-Green. You can visit his website, www.allthehappycreatures.blogspot.com, to find out more about his research and work. His book, Sync Book, Myths, Magic, Media, and Mindscapes, is available on Amazon.com. All right, Alan, we're going to move on to the topic of your new book regarding the connections of 9/11, bin Laden, and the assassination of JFK. Can you talk to us about your findings?
Sure, yeah. Ultimately, I think this is a great segue from what we were just talking about. We get into all these really gray areas, and I don't know, those are the areas that really interest me. So I don't know if anyone's familiar with, there was it's not really a book, it's a long essay written in the 80s by this guy, James Shelby Downer, did this book called King Kill 33. And I don't actually resonate with a lot of what's in there, a lot of his conclusions, and a lot of his preconceived notions as to what it all means. I mean, the guy probably uses the word evil, every other sentence. It's like, and this symbolism is evil because whatever. So it really bothered me. However, what the man is essentially doing is what I might consider synchromysticism with the JFK assassination. He's showing how there's resonance with the shape of the landscape, with the mythology, with certain names, with just certain archetypes as they emerge, commonalities with geographic commonalities. It's obviously taking place very close to the 33rd parallel. So he's showing other events that take place on the 33rd parallel and then connecting them. In his mind, everything comes back to evil Masons. I think ultimately what he's doing, and his basic premise is that it's an alchemical story being told with the death of JFK. That I don't know if we have people that are familiar with alchemy. There's the idea you have the death of the king as a sort of central tenet of alchemy, and he saw this as evil alchemists who were doing this to essentially manifest their story. Again, someone pulled the trigger. Again, someone covered it up. I'm not trying to make the point that it's not a conspiracy. However, what I'm really trying to focus on is the synchronicities and these gray areas where it's not so easy to just label this as intentional or unintentional. And that's, so I guess for JFK, I sort of used Downard as a jumping off point, where we're just kind of taking trying to lay out some of what he found, and some of the things that I think are really excellent points, and then trying to show other interpretations of it. So I'll come back to JFK, but then there's three big events, and I'm kind of doing an overview, but basically focusing on three events. So you have JFK, you have 9/11, and you have the quote-unquote death of bin Laden, which, on a very practical sense, I don't believe that bin Laden was killed last year. And, that story is just full of holes and question marks. However, I think it's a lot more important on a symbolic level than most people sort of paid attention to. Either, for the average American, it was, oh, bin Laden's dead, yay, we get to wave some flags and stuff like that. It's a sort of feel-good story, which is sick in itself, that no matter who it is, that a bunch of people celebrating murder. So there's that, and then you have, even for the conspiracy crowd, everyone went, oh, that's nonsense. Like, come on, they threw his body in the ocean. Come on, he died years ago, or whatever anyone's particular theory was. And everyone just went, come on, and moved right along. And I don't think people recognized how important that moment was. Again, not because I believe that the story is true, but how it sort of all played out, I think, is really fascinating. And I guess in between that, you have 9/11, where I'm using, Jake Kotza had written years ago this idea of the 9/11 Stargate, and I'm using that as a jumping off point. The same way I'm using sort of Downard as a jumping off point, where Downard explored all the synchronicities around JFK. Jake Kotza examined a lot of the synchronicities around 9/11. What I'm doing is sort of laying out some of their material, showing where I agree or disagree, and then adding my own findings, and then showing how the death of bin Laden, or the quote-unquote death of bin Laden, really was a continuation of that same story. If you want me to get into some specifics, I see someone wrote into the idea of symbolic killing of a king, towers also a symbol, killing of an icon. Oh, wonderful. Someone wrote, interesting, those are all themes from Lord of the Rings, too. Yeah, so exactly. So let's just kind of jump off there. Twin Towers. A lot of people have made the connection to the temple, Solomon's temple. These are the twin pillars of Solomon's temple. And we, of course, a lot of us know that World Trade Center 7, what everyone calls the third building that fell that day, was known as the Solomon Building. It's actually spelled differently, but we all understand it's the Solomon Building. So you have the Solomon Building, and the two pillars fall down. This is obviously Solomon's temple. And then everyone goes, hey, Solomon's temple, the Masons are into that. Oh my God. Well, yes, and I'm the end guy, A-N-D. It's like, not but. It's like, okay, sure. Yeah, there's definitely Masonic connections all over this stuff. But there's also a lot more. And so we look at that. So the person who mentioned the Lord of the Rings, we have the Lord of the Rings movies coming out around this time, and what it was there, they have the two towers, and then they have the Return of the King. Now, if we want to take this as the alchemical narrative, the king doesn't just die. It's not like you just assassinate the king. The alchemical narrative is that the king dies. The king has this out-of-body spiritual experience, and that the other people that were still living have to sometimes take part in. And then the king is regenerated. Usually he's brought back to life, or put back on the throne with a spiritual understanding. Now, someone could intentionally play with this imagery because, like, look at George Bush, right? The Solomon's Temple falls, which to me, I can get into it, but to me, 9/11 is a king kill. It's also a queen kill, but it's the king and queen both die on 9/11, and I can explain that. But this is very much the same imagery. Now, you could take a George Bush who, says, I'm the decider, and God talks to me, and he tells me we have to invade Iraq. Well, that's, obviously bullshit, if you'll excuse the expression. I mean, he could be hoping to, in theory, I don't know if George Bush is familiar with alchemical texts, but let's even say, here's your story. Here's a guy who sees himself on the throne, full of the presence of and wisdom of God, and he's going to make all the choices. Or that's the image he'd like to put out there. Sure, that's all very possible. That doesn't mean that the actual meaning stops there. And I would argue there's a lot of elements of this symbolism occurring within these events that no one would have controlled, that probably people never would have even thought of. Or if they did, hell, that's just as interesting. But let's take, so I've laid out JFK, obviously the president is assassinated. That's the death of a king. 9/11, we'll quickly say you have, I don't know if you guys are familiar with like Masonic literature, there's the character Hirma Biff. So James Shelby Downard compares JFK to Hirma Biff because Hirma Biff is assassinated by these three, what they call unworthy craftsmen. So he relates this to the three tramps on the, and all this sort of stuff. So you have the architect of Solomon's Temple, if you will, in JFK, which he's a lot more than just resonating with that figure. But let's just start there. Bear in mind, before I forget, JFK is famous for his World War II Navy career, which was in the Solomon Islands. So that's probably where he got his sort of a lot of his credibility, let's say, is with his Navy career. So Solomon Islands. Now, World Trade Center we know is is Solomon's Temple. We know that in the base of the World Trade Center, but they had what they called the bathtub. It was basically because it's built so close to the river, there's this deep foundation under the World Trade Center site, which they called the bathtub. You can look up online, anyone who's unfamiliar with it, alchemical symbolism, that the king and queen actually go into a bath to die. They go into the alchemical bath. They strip off their clothes, they get into the bath, they have sex, they die. And then they're reborn as a sort of divine hermaphrodite. This is the sort of alchemical metaphor for the progression of what each and every one of us must do. If it were to be taken literally, obviously the king's not going to be reincarnated. Obviously the king's not coming back. If we were to take it literally, then it's a really dark symbolism. Yeah, if we take it literally, I gave the example of George Bush. I myself am an anarchist. I don't like the idea of any king or any external king. So it's not like I want to, and I don't want an enlightened philosopher king sitting on the throne. I don't want that. But it's a metaphor for a personal journey, and in that respect, it's quite beautiful. I need to sort of throw that out there. But the king and queen die in the bath. So you have here where the Twin Towers fall into the bathtub at the World Trade Center site. You also have that we then go and invade Iraq with which is known for its bath party. It's funny if we think about the coup party music. We go from the coup party to the bath party. And someone wrote here, the king can also be seen as the ego. That's actually the biggest point of what I'm trying to make in all this. But so it's definitely an ego death. In my opinion, this is all symbolic of an ego death. Just sort of a lot of information I'm trying to hit. So if you take that this falls into the bathtub, then we go into Iraq. A lot of people have made the point that it's we call it shock and awe, which is essentially an expression for what was found at the Holy of Holies in Solomon's Temple. This is the divine presence of God that you would find in Solomon's Temple. So Solomon's Temple falls, and then the Shekinah is loosed upon the world. well, this is, obviously someone is playing with their symbolism, and yet there's, again, a lot that I would consider a gray area. Just to quickly jump to the next thing, Osama bin Laden, Barack Obama, the week of bin Laden's reported death, you have the week before was Easter Sunday. What is Easter known for? The rebirth of the king, right? This Jesus figure who was called the King of Kings, the newborn king. He's got the crown of thorns. It's the rebirth of the king on Easter. Well, then that's on Sunday. Then on Wednesday, Barack Obama releases his birth certificate. After drumming up all this drama about his birth certificate, he releases his birth certificate. Well, symbolically, what he's doing is he's being reborn. By reintroducing his birth certificate, he's being reborn. Then on Saturday, he, at the press correspondence dinner, he says, I showed you my birth certificate, but now let me show you my birth video. So he makes this whole big joke about how he's going to show a video of his live birth. And what do they show but a clip from Disney's Lion King? And it's the clip of the Lion King being held up over everybody, circle of life, all that sort of stuff. So it's a few things to consider there. He's saying, I'm the king. I'm the newborn king. He's very heavy messianic imagery there. But let's take it a step further. He's saying he's the Lion King. All right? That's actually really important. The next day, after telling the world he's the Lion King, he tells the world, I killed Osama bin Laden, which everyone obviously makes the connection between how similar their names are. There were even news reports that day where they flubbed the phrase, Obama's dead. We mean Osama's dead. That was that constant thing. But check it out. Osama in Arabic means lion. Osama in Japanese means king. So you have Barack Obama saying, I'm the Lion King. Guess what? I just killed the Lion King. And if you know anything about, we want to bring this back to Solomon's Temple and all this sort of stuff, if you know anything, Manly P. Hall writes about it, and Albert Pike writes about it, that the way that Hiram Abiff is raised from the dead is with what's called the lion's grip. This is a very important thing, and if someone wants to look into this, the lion symbolism is all over it. So start to piece some of that together. Now let me backtrack to 9/11 for a moment. You have directly overhead, you have at the moment that the towers fall, you have not at the exact zenith, but very close, is the constellation of Leo is rising overhead. And I'm not well versed in astrology, but I had somebody else look at the astrology at the moment, and we were in the period of Leo for those few hours. Again, I don't want to claim that I fully understand the astrology of it, but just to throw that out there, that apparently that was that element was there. What I can tell you about the astronomy of it is that directly overhead, as the buildings are falling, in the Egyptian constellation system, is the constellation of Horus. So the temples, Solomon's Temple falls, the Twin Towers fall, and you have Horus directly overhead. This brings in the Egyptian trinity Osiris, Isis, Horus. So if you can picture in your mind, if you're familiar with New York geography, or if you're not, I encourage anyone to look on a map. You can see where the Statue of Liberty is in respect to Manhattan Island, and it's very, very, very close. You can actually, standing at the tip of Manhattan, you get a really nice view of Statue of Liberty. So right there, and if you look at actually the satellite images of it, you see all the smoke billowing out from the World Trade Center is covering the Statue of Liberty. Now, you'll forgive, this is going to be, I suppose, sexually explicit, but the mythology of Osiris is that Osiris is dismembered into 14 pieces, okay? his wife, Isis, is able to collect 13 of them. What she is not able to collect is his penis. It's the missing 14th piece is Osiris's penis. And what she ends up doing is she creates an artificial phallus with which to create Horus. This is really important. If you look at a map of New York, you're going to see that the island of Manhattan really looks like a graphic cartoon penis. But it's an island, so it's sort of a dismembered penis. If you know that the Statue of Liberty is literally designed as a representation of Isis. They were making a statue of Isis. Well, what you see is when the towers fall, this white cloud of smoke coming out of the tip of Manhattan, billowing all over the Statue of Liberty, Isis, while Horus is rising in the sky directly overhead. You have a very specific mythology playing out at that moment that encodes this same story. And then we can bring it back to JFK. Let's go backwards one more time. Go back to JFK. Downard had he kind of understands that JFK resonates with Osiris, but he doesn't fully get it. Jackie Kennedy ends up later in life actually editing a book about the mythology of Osiris and Isis. And a biographer of Jackie says that Jackie said how much she really felt immense sympathy with this story of Isis picking up the pieces of her dead husband. I mean, what does Jackie has, brains splattered all over her lap? Sort of this idea of being confronted with her dead husband, kind of picking up the pieces, both literally and metaphorically. Jackie edits a book about Osiris and Isis, says that she feels like a really strong personal resonance with these figures. She actually was one of the people who instrumental in bringing the Temple of Dendur. If anyone's ever been to the Metropolitan Museum here in New York, it's probably their biggest exhibit. It's this giant temple that they brought over stone for stone from Egypt. And Jackie was instrumental in bringing that over. She wanted it to be in D.C. as a monument to JFK. She couldn't get them to put it in D.C., so she got it placed in New York at the Metropolitan Museum. Apparently, she actually complained that the spotlights around this Egyptian temple, she could see them from her window, and they kept her up at night. So here you have this, and this Egyptian temple is connected to it's actually a worship of Hathor and Hathor Isis. There's a sort of combined goddess figure. But you see this sort of interplay between this. So Jackie is Isis, JFK is Osiris. Here on 9/11, you see, Osiris and Isis playing out. When we talk about Bin Laden and Barack Obama, you really have very much the same thing. Even with the sea burial, all this sort of stuff. I don't know how familiar people are with the mythology of it, but it's one of the things I'm feeling like my only thing with writing this book, the only difficulty is I never know how much I have to explain. But to say that Osiris, he's actually killed twice. He's first killed and then sent down the Nile River, and then she finds him, and then he's killed a second time, and he's cut into 14 pieces. So this idea of throwing Bin Laden's body into the ocean. And I'll give you one last little, really major connection here is the trident. And ultimately what you have is that Dealey Plaza is shaped like a trident. A lot of people have commented on this. And if you look at the World Trade Center, the Twin Towers actually have tridents built into them very, very explicitly, and they almost look exactly like the road leading to Dealey Plaza. Just so simple Google searches, you could probably find some images to see what I'm talking about. Well, bear in mind that Bin Laden was quote-unquote killed in a military operation called Operation Neptune Spear. Well, if you know, Neptune doesn't have a spear, he has a trident. So you have this trident symbolism. Now things start to get a little weirder when you see that the trident is also a sort of prop of Shiva, and what you'll notice is that this connection to Shiva at CERN, which plays pretty strongly into this whole Bin Laden ritual, and bear in mind it's the same weekend as the royal wedding, so you have, there's obviously again the alchemical marriage of the king and queen being together, aside from the fact that they're both kings, the lion kings. You have CERN, so CERN puts this statue of Shiva outside, also with the trident. Well, Oppenheimer famously, during the first atomic explosion at the Trinity site, quoted Shiva, saying, now I am become death, which is what Downard is saying, that the JFK assassination, he's showing how it's connected to this Trinity explosion. So you have, again, like this constant sort of Shiva metaphor, which I see very much as connected to ego death. This is male and female principles, so for Downer, this whole fertility ritual, blah, blah, blah. Ultimately, it's a lot more complex than that. And I'm sorry if it's really hard to kind of get it all in there really concisely, but that's a really big, kind of overview of looking at how all these things really are telling the same story. It's the same story being told in different manifestations. Now, if these obviously are all, in a sense, political coups, 9/11 we saw, it was a political coup. The Bin Laden killing is covering it up. There's a very intentional aspect to all this, and yet someone wrote here, cyclical archetypal dramas. Exactly. If I hadn't been doing my work with synchromysticism for all this time, I probably would just put a big rubber stamp on it and saying, this is ritual, this is high stakes ritual, which I'm, again, very open to. There does seem to be that ritual aspect, but it's not the full it's not the full answer. The fact is that I can find this same mythology playing out in, a children's cartoon or in a conversation that I overhear at the park. This is why synchronicity is important, because it puts it into perspective. When all these guys, conspiracy theorists, modern conspiracy theorists and old-time conspiracy theorists, who say, hey, look, here's Rosicrucian symbolism, here's Freemasonic symbolism, here's all this stuff. My argument is that what these guys, the Masons and Rosicrucians and all these guys, what they're really tapping into, what they're mapping out, is the structure of the universe. That these stories, you're breaking reality down into an archetypal cycle, exactly as you say, an archetypal cycle. That's what it is. So the story of the king kill in alchemy is a story of how, it's a metaphor for how life operates and how archetypes emerge in time. So, with the Kabbalistic, we can take this Kabbalistic tree. We talk about, the alchemists were kind of trying to make this, when we said before, this sort of map of uncharted territory or the intangible mindscape. They were building these maps already. So if you see these archetypes emerge, you can't say, look, a Freemason put it there. Because bear in mind, it's probably not his symbol. He's just recognizing it. If anything, I think the strongest thing this is evidence of is proof that the old school Rosicrucians and Masons and alchemists were essentially correct in their mapping of a fractal holographic universe. And all we're seeing is, we're seeing those same symbols emerge, those same archetypes emerge, because they were essentially correct in their mapping. I hope that's I hope that made some sense.
Would they be mapping out their own psyche, their own structure, and laying it on the universe as how the universe is organized? I mean,
Yeah, that's a fair question. I don't think you can. I don't think it works ultimately to that degree. I've studied the idea of magic. Like, so there are ways to create synchronicities. Chaos magicians and sigil magicians. We know that it's capable. Where the
yeah, but the
capabilities there to
structure, the
yeah.
actual structure doesn't necessarily depend on a magic or on an incantation or anything. I mean, it's a if the structure of the human body and the human psyche, the human nature, is a resonance, if you would, of that universal patterning, wouldn't we see it everywhere we looked anyway?
And that's exactly it. Yeah. And don't we? Like, the human
Yeah.
body has the Fibonacci sequence in it. All of nature does.
Right.
We can kind of pinpoint to a certain degree that, fingerprint of the universe that doesn't need an evil mason to put it there.
Right. Right.
So exactly. So I think, like, if we found the Fibonacci sequence, we don't go, oh my God. We just go, oh, okay. So my point is, if we can
Another
see.
one.
Yeah, it's another sort of fingerprint. Now, if you want to put a little disclaimer on that, is to say that this is of course, a gray area. Because they are playing with, some of them are playing with a willful
Yeah.
structuring of reality, or you want to play with some of that. I think the disclaimers are fair.
Can't.
Right. So if you want to put that disclaimer on it, that there, like, of course, that's when I'm saying there are really gray areas.
Yeah.
Yes, I admit absolutely there are gray areas. I'm not trying to say, I mean, as I made the point before, it's not like, oh, this is all the will of, you want to call
Yeah,
it God
right.
or the universe or anything. I'm not trying to make that point. What I am trying to say is you at least have to factor this unintentional
Right.
archetypal imagery into it. And perhaps, if anything, like, so obviously the guy who, the architect of the World Trade Center, he knew what he was doing. He was building Solomon's Temple. That's obvious.
Yeah.
Perhaps the guys who took it down even were aware of its symbolic meaning. But the question is, are they completely aware of all the ripples that come from playing with such a thing? That I guess would be my question. And I think I haven't seen enough evidence to see that these guys are that in control. I think
Sure.
if anything, I think they're
Opportunistic, maybe.
opportunistic and at times sloppy and at times kind of just running with it. You don't just say, "Hey, I threw Bin Laden's body in the ocean." You don't really do that. Something made you go, "Oh shit, I got to do this now."
Right.
Now, whether that was because your black magician, behind the scenes is going like, "Do it now," and you can, whatever. Perhaps, but I really don't. Like I said, I haven't seen the evidence to say that they are this in control. There's too much that again, I can only say this because of all my personal experiences that I know on a daily basis. I'm encountering these things that there's no way that anyone else in the universe is even aware of what this means to me and how this is emerging. And if I see it happen to me as I'm walking down the street, well, then I have to accept that it emerging in these high ritualistic events, that I just have to be aware that there's a gray area that's not so easily defined. That's if anything, I'm really trying to make that point because I do think there's ritual. I said you have the royal wedding taking the same place. It's like some of this stuff is like no doubt they're aware of what they're doing, and yet are they aware of what they're completely doing? That's why I brought it back to that, like, when I said before, the propaganda, that guy thinks he's controlling the message,
Right.
but is he? But there's always the unintentional is always going to seep in. The universe is infinitely more interesting than any of these guys could ever hope to make it.
Yeah. Yeah. I'd have to agree.
And so I just want to, we take this idea of time. I just want to, if I may, just bring it to this moment of time is like when, so you have CERN at the same point, being active, you have, we could bring pop culture into it. The Bin Laden weekend. Well, I noticed, and the thing is, I actually wrote about it before it happened. This is how I knew I was able to say what was happening. The week before, I said, all right, this weekend, the king is going to get shot in the head. And I was trying to figure out who the king was. I know a lot of you guys are familiar with Cliff High's work, correct? Webbot?
Right.
Yes.
Yes.
So do you remember? So there was something Cliff High said a while back, which was kind of stuck with me, where he said like they had predicted a I guess I should just put the disclaimer. There's a lot of people in synchromysticism who are opposed to future predictions, although they all accept that it can be used for that. It's a sort of debatable area, but I just sort of wanted to sort of prove it to myself and to my readers that like there was a non-linear phenomenon that we were experiencing and observing. But Cliff High made the point that they had predicted some nautical accident, like there was something was going to happen to a ship, and what ended up happening was I think like that was the shuttle disaster, and he said, oh, that's because he realized later that's because it was the archetype was correct. Here's the spaceships use nautical terminology, but it's a ship that sails in the sky and a ship that sails in the ocean. But basically, he realized on an archetypal level, it was accurate. Well, that's the thing here. We're able to nail the archetypes and say, this is the next archetype that's going to emerge. What I was trying to figure out was like exactly who was it, and this is why like you can kind of narrow it down. And I'd be curious how similar Cliff's methodology and my own is. The only difference I see with what we're doing is it's very organic, So this is we're factoring in our personal synchronicities and using that to narrow it down. Yeah, I think it might have been Challenger that he was talking about. I don't recall, but I think that was a really excellent point that he made. So ultimately, we're using our personal synchronicities as a factor that I don't think he is. So it's like if I'm watching and I go, hey, wait a second, it seems like, I don't know, it seems like the king's going to die this weekend. And what I said is the king's going to get shot in the head, and he resonates with the Antichrist. And I don't believe in a literal Antichrist, but I meant like the archetype, some sort of Antichrist figure. And I said, well, it's really interesting because this weekend you have the royal wedding. There's like this whole group of people that thinks Prince William is the Antichrist. Then you had all these people who thought Barack Obama was the Antichrist. And then you had Gabby Giffords, who people started to say, well, she survived this head wound. Maybe she's the Antichrist. So what was really interesting is that Barack Obama was supposed to be with Gabby Giffords that weekend. And here you have the royal wedding happening. I'm like, okay, so here's our three quote-unquote candidates for the Antichrist, all sort of doing some high-stakes stuff this weekend. This should be pretty interesting. But what I if I had paid attention to, like, better attention to my personal synchronicities, and this is where I admit a mishap on my own part, is that I had noticed this weird, like, attraction to the work of an actor, Sam Elliott. He's this, you probably know him, the guy with the big gray mustache.
Yep.
And I was like, kept noticing Sam Elliott, and I didn't exactly know why. And it was only after the Bin Laden, the reporting of Bin Laden's death that I realized it. I decided, okay, well, I was pretty right, but I missed the cue here. I said the king here. Osama means king. Okay, it was all right, but what did I miss? And I decided to look at Sam Elliott. Sam Elliott a writer on the time had was in this movie that was being released like a week later or 2 weeks later. I think it was just about a week and a half later, called The Big Bang, and he plays a scientist at CERN in this movie. But the tagline for the movie, so I actually had seen that, and I'm like, okay, so there's something with CERN. What's up with that? The tagline for the movie is the quest for the ultimate missing person ends at the beginning of the universe, or something like that. But the quest for the ultimate missing person. Well, who was the quote unquote Antichrist, quote unquote ultimate missing person? Like, oh, of course, it was Bin Laden. So it was like, this was a personal synchronicity. It wouldn't have made sense to anybody else. But do you get what I mean? So like, this is what you have to factor in your personal experience, and you know that it's not just some Illuminati playing a game. It's like, even if it's their ritual, you can still pick up on reverberations of it. And ultimately, I just ultimately feel like it's, even if it's their ritual, it has a personal metaphor. Someone typed into the chat here before about, the king is the ego. Well, absolutely, the king is the ego, and any self-respecting alchemist will tell you, the king is the ego. The metaphor for the death of the king, and then what he needs to be reinstated, full of godly wisdom, is basically, you got to kill the ego. You have to understand the wider perspective outside of yourself, so that when you bring your quote-unquote self, or your capital S self, back, when the ego is there, the ego can be properly applied, instead of just being selfish or flopping around blindly. You understand your role in the wider scheme of things, and then you can apply yourself to it. So this idea of this ego death is very, very strongly connected to that. Look at the falling of Solomon's temple, right? The falling of Solomon's temple. What is JFK basically getting shot in the head? This is Solomon's temple in the Bible. There's the expression where they say Solomon's temple was not meant to be, neither hammer nor nail was heard in the construction of the temple. What does that mean? It means it's a metaphor. Solomon's temple was a metaphor. What do you have on either side of your head? Your temples. Do you understand? So
I do, yeah.
They're like getting shot in the head, getting your head cut off, killing the king, the falling of the temple. These are all metaphors for being woken up to a wider reality in this wider field. That doesn't mean that there aren't. And like I said, I know I'm really tricky language here, because people think like Aeon of Horus and this is evil occultist. I'm like, I get all that. I'm just saying I would be lying to you if I said it wasn't, if it didn't strongly resonate with something deeply personal and something deeply universal. That's probably much more important than whatever George Bush does on his weekends with his buddies in black coats.
Hey, Alan.
Yeah.
I have a question for you. Do you think 9/11 is symbolic of an ego death of the American state?
Oh, sure. Yeah. It's really interesting. A friend of mine, a gentleman who writes, his name's Michael Schacht. He's in the First Sync book. He writes at gossporn.blogspot.com. He made the point just recently that you see this year, what are they doing is they knock down the two towers, and everyone says, now they're putting up the One World Trade Tower, right? This quote-unquote Freedom Tower and all that sort of stuff.
You mean the NWO Tower?
Right. So they're putting up this, and listen, I live in New York. I'm pretty disgusted by it. Trust me, this has I have a personal sort of, interest in, wow, this is pretty hideous. Yeah, absolutely. So it's not that I'm just trying to paint, everything is roses here. But like I said, and my friend Michael, he pointed out that while they're putting up this single tower, they're also putting up what's called the Shard in London, which just opened. And he thought that it was an interesting, particularly with the royal wedding and all this sort of stuff, that you see the second is he thought of it as, if you consider the Shard and this new Freedom Tower, or whatever you want to call it, the NWO Tower, if you consider that the new Twin Towers, that it was a sort of bridging of America being reintegrated into the British Empire, or however you want to perceive that. I would argue that, it's probably never really been that removed.
Yeah. But
but
it's fascinating that.
yeah, oh, very much so. So is it the death of of the American ego? Well, it certainly was a blow to the American ego. That's for damn sure. And then you have opportunists come in and try and all right, I'm just gonna say it. I gave the example before of a psychedelic experience, and again, I want to stress it doesn't have to be psychedelic, but what I go back to this because I think it's some of the most literal examples we can give. Richard Alpert, there's a famous interview with Richard Alpert where he was talking about his, ego death experience, and Humphrey Osmond, the Canadian researcher who doesn't get enough credit, and they were talking about this idea that the ego struggles, the ego doesn't want to die. So
No.
that when your fear kicks in, it's because the ego doesn't want to go, and it's going to fight. And of course, again, this has a very useful role in everyday life, our survival instinct. But I think ultimately this sort of American lashing out is the ego floundering, the ego struggling. We can definitely see it as representing that, of course. So the question is, has the American ego fully died? And what does that mean for us? I mean, a lot of us live in America. What does that mean for us? If you're, one of the, sort of new patriots, you're Alex Jones types, and this is something really terrible, and you got to get your guns and fight somebody. If you're someone who doesn't want to be, I think the question is, for a guy like me, I don't want the American empire or the Chinese empire or the New World Order empire or the United Nations empire or the Russian empire. I don't want any of these empires. So, the question is, I don't see the death of the American empire's ego as ultimately as a bad thing. I'm not worried about America going down. I am worried about America floundering violently. I do, of course, I'll have to live through that, as we all will, and that's going to be pretty damn ugly. But you don't want to, I guess the question that would come from that is, do you create a power vacuum? So if America goes down, who steps up? What I would like to think is that if we all understand what this sort of deeper metaphor is here, we can kind of bring this back to where we were earlier in the conversation, is that the personally empowering ourselves is that let the American ego go. Let the New World Order ego go. Let all that shit go. And realize that you have a place to position yourself. My friend Jason Barrera, also from the Sync book, he makes the point, we always see, the eye in the eye at the pyramid, the eye in the pyramid. Oh my God, this evil symbol, right? He says it's an eye at the top of the pyramid. Is EYE or is it I? Me.
I.
Right.
Yes.
So it's like, so who's the real, potentially the real person at the top of the pyramid? And I guess, see, I'm the kind of guy that I have to throw out a caveat for everything is, I don't mean that that can very easily become the new ego tyrant. We see it in every coup, every revolution, everything. Moses, liberates the slaves, then says, "Now you're gonna listen to me and give me your robes and give me your gold and all this." No, screw you. Ultimately, we have this power vacuum where we see throughout history, one king goes out, and the guy who's fighting him, he becomes the new tyrant. Ultimately, when we want to talk about this alchemical cycle of the king kill, I think it's actually a warning of that we could see how easily you can become the new tyrant. So we don't want, when we say I at the top of the pyramid, it's not that I want to lord over people, and it's not that, and we should be really aware to resist that temptation within our own lives, within our family and circle of friends and all that sort of stuff. Is you don't ever want to put yourself at the apex and become the new tyrant. It's to put yourself at the apex with a personal power. And the reason the king needs to die first, to have that ego death, to be humbled to the wider field, is that his actions are properly applied. If I just became the eye at the top of the pyramid and I told all of you, all right, now, do my laundry and wash my dishes and, whatever, that would be pretty screwed up. If I have the experience where I understand my wider role in society and in life, and I say, okay, now I'm going to be a self-empowered person that contributes something to the greater good, or of course my own good. Again, ego is not the ultimate enemy here, so of course you should look out for yourself, and there's immense value in that. But just again, like, to have a wider understanding of your role, that since we're all connected, what synchronicity is showing us, that everything is so interconnected in ways that we could never imagine, is that you must take care of yourself, you must take care of others, and you must properly apply your personal power.
Yeah. But you said a word that stuck out a minute ago. You said circle. And maybe if we can get rid of the pyramid altogether and become circles, and circles holding hands, even facing one another, that would be a real rebirth.
Yes, yes, yes. Now, I didn't explain it because it's hard enough to explain all this in a few minutes anyway, but there's two major factors that I'm dealing with in this book. One is the Osiris mythology, and the other is what's known as a Catherine wheel. Okay. And
Yes,
so when
I
you
know.
say circle, this is really important. And I first started paying attention to it because of the Norway spiral. But we have what's known as a Catherine wheel, and if
It's
you
also the shape of the Milky Way.
right, I mean, it's such an integral symbol. I mean, these are, I don't mean to just kind of, if we really just wanted to boil this down, this is ego and id. This is masculine and female. The king and the 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 Catherine wheel. What is the Catherine wheel? That's the sacred feminine. That's the the womb, or the void in which the ego goes to die. If I may be, I think we're all adults here. You know what the petite mort is? The small
Yes.
death. So what
Yes.
happens? The king, the structure of architecture, right? It's a building of a tower. Then he enters into the void, has the small death, the king dies. And yet you've inseminated a new epoch. Do you understand what I'm
Yes.
saying? So this is
Absolutely.
very much the right. So someone right here, the big O. You know, this is really important, and we're seeing this play out. Do we know that? Do we know that on 9/11, if anyone studied Dr. Judy Wood's work, there was this giant spinning hurricane that no one knew anything about, Hurricane Erin, right there on 9/11. Well, what is that? That's your Catherine wheel is right there.
That's right. Yes.
So,
Wow.
this it's a little hard to explain, but I think if if fully, but if you're getting me, these are the archetypes. This is the true this is the true story that's playing out here. That I know, if maybe we want to take it this way. Some you guys wrote to me that you wanted to talk about Saturn. Saturn gets a really bad rap, in my opinion. So Osiris can be compared with Saturn. So I'm saying I'm really focusing on the Catherine wheel and Osiris. Now, Osiris can be compared to Saturn very much. He's equated with time, death, and rebirth. Agriculture. He has the sickle, which he uses to reap. We see this as the Grim Reaper. We see this as Kronos. We see it over and over. Father Time. The same figure. A lot of people take this Saturn stuff as, oh look, it's since Saturn mythologically eats his children, they take this. I just see this over and over again. It's like these cults that worship Saturn that are pedophiles and children abusers. Now that may be the case. Again, like what someone does in the name of an archetype. I've seen how many people go out and rape and murder and bomb countries in the name of Jesus, who says turn the other cheek. Do you get what I'm saying? So what someone does in the name of an archetype should not tarnish the archetype. So,
But there's different levels within the archetype. There's a
right,
positive and negative
yeah,
application of the archetype.
absolutely yes. I just want to say though is that ultimately what is Saturn is a cycle. You know, he's showing an agricultural cycle where, you know, things are born and then die and then are reborn out of it. And a lot of people take this as very dark symbolism, but if we just look at it as, you know, there's a reason it's equated with agriculture. The Illuminati didn't decide, oh, plants are going to grow in the summer and die in the winter.
No.
You know, so if we realize, again, this is why I'm saying this is how life operates. It said ashes to ashes, dust to dust. We are going to return to something, and yet there's something eternal within that. Wonderful. Green Meadow wrote, so is the lesson that perpetual growth is ending. Right? We have this idea we are going to infinitely sustain, and we can make the sexual, we can bring back to sexual imagery and joke again. We're going to infinitely sustain, you know, but it doesn't work that way. Empires rise and fall. And you know, everything does. Well, all of us are going to die someday. Yet there is the eternal that part. There's the part of us that is eternal that lives on, and yet there is this physical existence that has to go back into where it came from, and only to become fertilizer for the next wave of humans. If we want to look at that as an excuse for a sacrifice, then it's evil, and that is dark. You know, to say, hey, we can go and commit a Holocaust or a genocide because, hey, we're going to make, you know, room for the next, you know, paving of a Illuminati utopia, then that's disgusting, of course. But if we just say, well, wait a second, let's be real for a second. I myself, I'm going to die. I hope my body, you know, fertilizes some new growth. I hope that I continue to be part of this cycle, in a very real sense that has nothing to do with any external power structure.
Yeah, yeah. But also Saturn, in the symbology of it, it's about moving out of having an outer authority, which is the negative aspect, and coming into one's own authority. And that's a death and rebirth cycle as well.
Oh, very much. You know, look at if I may, like look at so the Saturnian myth is really integral to this king kill because Saturn actually comes. So his father is Uranus,
Right.
and what does Saturn do? He cuts off his father's testicles.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we can connect this again to Osiris with the dismembered phallus, but it's basically like cutting off the masculine, you know, authority essentially. So Saturn takes out Uranus, and he becomes the new king of the universe. Then Zeus comes along, and he kills Saturn, and he's the new king. And then I would actually argue that Athena is essentially an aspect of the same thing, where she's bursting out of Zeus's head, is very much that same ego death king kill, where she's bursting out of his head, is the same idea. So we have, you know, we're constantly trying to do this ultimately with the hope that we don't become the next tyrant. Oh no, you sorry, I see you wrote here, you better stop and not hog it. Go ahead. I mean, ultimately I just want to say is like what we see in the Saturnian story, if we take it in the wider context, is that Saturn becomes the tyrant that Uranus was. Zeus, I would argue, becomes the tyrant that Saturn was. And we have to hope that Athena, the story sort of ends at Athena, but I would like to think Athena, if anything, represents maybe the end of that cycle. She's supposed to be wisdom and a balance of both, you know, physicality and you know, mental prowess, and hopefully, and bear in mind she's also the first female to enter this cycle, so that's important as well. But hopefully that sort of, you know, wisdom, and we could even take this to a Gnostic idea of Sophia and all that sort of stuff. Hopefully,
Yes.
this idea of the wisdom coming out and hopefully putting an end to that cycle. And yet, we just must always be aware that not to fall into the trap to become the next tyrant.
But this is a beautiful example of once one really begins to study and understand and know what the symbols and archetypes are, they're not so constrained as we're led to believe, and it opens up so many different possibilities. So I really appreciate you speaking about all this, Alan.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate your viewpoint very, very much.
Yeah.
So it seems like now we're in a period where many conspiracy theories are looking like they're true. They're not conspiracy theories, they're conspiracy reality. And that's causing, an evaporation of people's perceptions of reality. And then, here we're talking about deaths of ego and how that's affecting people. How do you think these things are affecting people's psyche?
Oh, that's the tricky part. I mean, this is not an easy process. As any ego death is not an easy process. Again, whether it's meditation, there's a reason that people train so hard to become true yogis, right? You don't just stumble into it. The teenager who takes a hit of LSD probably doesn't just ace the experience. It's a time of learning and really, again, this is when I say it's like the floundering. I think we're in a tricky point right now. You talked about conspiracies. I don't mean to take it away from your question, but just throw in here. You guys said you want to talk about the Olympics. Bear in mind, I don't know if you're familiar with this band Muse.
Uh-huh.
Now, Muse, they've been on Alex Jones's show. They're sort of like the conspiracy band. I mean, they have songs about MK Ultra, about oh Jesus, there's actually a song where the songwriter says he's talking about Zygmunt Brzezinski in the song. It's called United States of Eurasia. He says it's about Zygmunt Brzezinski's grand chessboard. They are the conspiracy band, and for many years they were. I'm only aware of them because my wife was really into them, and I just never thought they'd be as big as they are now. Now suddenly we have 2012 Olympics, which is like the conspiracy Olympics. Don't you feel like it's the conspiracy? Everyone has a
Absolutely,
conspiracy
yeah.
theory about this Olympics, and now Muse is the performing the official song of the Olympics. I feel like it's like a mind fuck. Don't you think? It's like, oh, you think there's a conspiracy? Guess what?
Wow, I hadn't made that connection.
So I don't know. Like, I think we're in a really interesting times to be sure. Aside from all the ideas of 2012 and what 2012 signifies, but there seems to be this sort of weird integration of conspiracy culture into the mainstream, which I think we've always been fighting for. And now, as it starts to go mainstream, we have to figure out what does that mean. If it wasn't Muse, how do I put this? Like, okay, so if we trust that an artist was well intentioned, let's give Muse the benefit of the doubt for the moment. We don't have to completely, but just for the moment, let's entertain the thought that they are just well intentioned artists who got really into conspiracy stuff and tried to bring these ideas mainstream. And then they get offered, because of their popularity, they get offered the chance to work with the Olympics, and they say, "Hey, this is a great idea, great chance to bring attention to our work and a lot of the issues that we raise." And then they do it. Well, I think a lot of conspiracy theorists think anyone affiliated with these Olympics, they have to be evil, or they have to be in on it, or something. And that's certainly very possible.
Mm-hmm.
But if we're limited to that, then we're really screwed. Because any artist that tries to raise attention to something, or any of us, whether it's artistically or by doing radio programs or writing books or whatever our chosen method, we're hoping to get these ideas out. What happens? So then, once we get our ideas get spread wide enough, we all assume, oh, that guy's connected to something. Look, Alex Jones got a big mansion, and obviously, I actually don't like Alex Jones, but So, but and in his defense, here's a guy for many years. Everyone was like, "Hey, this guy's really legit," and then suddenly, "Hey, he's got a really big house and he keeps asking for money. I don't know, he's on what was he on? Like The View with Barbara Walters, like, and suddenly it's like, hey, wait a second, why is he on The View?" Well, if you got the opportunity to go on national television tomorrow and to tell the world about conspiracies, would you turn it down? And if you didn't, and if you thought, no, this is a great opportunity to spread the word, if you did it, and then everyone said, well, obviously she's in on the conspiracy because she got on national TV, they wouldn't let her on TV unless she was in on it. We've really opened ourselves up to some mental traps and really kind of tricky situations. We kind of, I was saying, is like we paint ourselves into a corner here where no one's allowed to make it without being part of the conspiracy. I think this is going to be our next challenge, is trying to figure that one out. If these are conspiracy facts, how do we talk about this without assuming everyone's in on it?
Yeah, it's getting more and more surreal. I mean, as we go away from mainstream media and go to alternative media, there's no fact checking with an alternative media in the way that mainstream media did in the past. And so you get in all this information and then you have to sift through it of which of this is real and which of this is, some wacko in his garage, or is this the guy in the garage who actually really knows his stuff? You can't tell.
Yeah. That's why you gotta, and that's why, like, the whole synchronicity and saying, hey, wait, this has meaning to me, I think is a really important lesson in this respect as well, because the guy who thinks there's reptiles on the moon, I can't convince him otherwise, right? That's his truth. Now, it might not be my truth, but that's his truth. And that's the truth that he came to, and that's his reality. So we get into this sort of territory of subjective reality. I can't convince him otherwise, and he can't convince me, that there are. I guess I'm open to the possibility, but I highly doubt it. Let me just put it that way. I'm not opposed to extraterrestrial presences or anything. I just saying, I don't think the Queen's a reptile. I just think she's a real bitch. I think she's a power-hungry, excuse me, but I think she's a power-hungry, horrible person. But I don't think she's a shape-shifting wizard from Dimension X. She doesn't need to be. Aren't horrible people enough? So I guess, and I'm not really trying to knock on these lines of thinking. My point is, that guy in the garage might be right, and the guy, or he might be completely crazy. But that's his truth. You have to find your truth, and then we have to figure out where do our truths overlap, and where can we find areas of agreement, and all this stuff. Someone wrote here, is it a metaphor for action that reminds us of a reptilian mindset? Well, exactly. When I first came across David Icke's work, I thought, well, here's a guy who seems to be taking this stuff way too literally. You could have someone who's acting very like a predator. That doesn't mean that they're a shape-shifting alien. It just means that you would equate with them this type of imagery, or this type of again, reptilian mindset, or something like that. So it's just really interesting. Like, again, is it a metaphor or is it literal? That's for everyone to kind of figure out for themselves. I'm comfortable with some of this stuff just being a metaphor. That it is someone who's just focused on their survival and being a predator, and they don't mind hurting other people. I think most of us on this call, and probably anyone listening to the show, is probably not in that mindset. But again, it's just, I'm not going to convince that guy otherwise, and why should I? That's his reality to deal with. Robert Anton Wilson, called these reality tunnels, and they're basically all valid. And to he had this really funny quote, which is like, everything is to some extent valid and not, and it goes on, but it's like, everything's real and yet real and imagined and not real, and valid enough. You know, it just sort of like goes down the list of everything kind of falls into these really gray areas. Ultimately, if we really want to pick everything apart, I'm trying not to go too far into that deep end. I don't, especially since I have an interest in the overlap with conspiracy stuff, I don't want to muddy the waters. Like to say, you know, everything is a metaphor and this is all symbolic of a personal growth doesn't mean that we suddenly go, 9/11 was a beautiful event that opened up, you know, everyone's eyes. No, it was, you know, it was a pretty horrific deed. Hopefully, it has a silver lining in that it also leads us to, I mean, I don't know about you guys, but like I said, for me, it was really, it started after 9/11 that I really started paying attention. So to me, 9/11 was a pathway to a higher consciousness. It was a pathway to the road I'm on right now. So in that respect, 9/11 was a quote unquote catalyzing event, you know, to use the expression of Project for New American Century. Those guys probably see it as a catalyzing event for their empire. I see it as a catalyzing event for my path of self-discovery. Uh, you know, both are existing, sort of coexisting at the moment. They're building their empire, and I'm trying to figure stuff out. Um, and part of what I'm figuring out is that I don't want them to lord over me. So if in that respect, it probably backfires on them.
Yeah, it's amazing how we have our own personal symbol language and personal experiences of the same event. And so you have, you know, someone thinking there's reptiles on the moon, or you have someone thinking, you know, 9/11 means this or means that. And it's all our own personal language that and personal mythology that we understand the world with.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Alan, this is Gemini, and I'm just curious why we're seeing more synchronicities and conspiracies around this particular Olympics versus years past. Do you have a thought on that? Or are we just becoming more aware of them?
I think like the reason that I'm focusing on 3 separate events is to show that this is not something new. Like I think if I hadn't been able to find the same imagery in JFK, I mean, I honestly, this book could have been never ending. I could have written about, you know, Julius Caesar. I could have written about Abraham Lincoln. You know, like any time where you see the archetype of the king kill. You know, even the story of Christ's crucifixion. What, you know, again, this again doesn't have to be a literal story. I don't know that I believe that's a literal story of a man named Jesus who died on a cross. But whether it's a story or not, the same archetypes are there in that story that are there in the killing of Julius Caesar. The same things are there in Osiris. The same things are there. Here's a great example I gave before about 9/11 with the bathtub, right? Martin Luther King, whose name is King. Do you know the story, and there are alternative theories to this, but the main story is that Martin Luther King was shot by James Earl Ray. James Earl Ray was in a hotel across the street, standing in a bathtub, leaning out the window, and shot Martin Luther King. So though the king was not actually in the bathtub, here we see him connected to the king in the bathtub again. Then we take what's her name? Whitney Houston. Whitney Houston's really, this is a pop culture example, but really freaking interesting because Martin Luther King is killed by James Earl Ray, or Whitney Houston is found dead in the bathtub by J. Ray, I think his name is, or Ray J. I don't know, some musician, but it's basically instead of J. Sorry, yeah, James Earl Ray. So J. Ray, and I think she's found dead by Ray J. I'll be honest, I don't know the musician. I don't know who Ray J is, but apparently that's the guy who finds Whitney Houston dead in the bathtub. So you see this connection between those two figures. She, you know, Barrett, she was she's the musician from Bodyguard, who you have connected to JFK, right? She's Kevin Costner, Bodyguard, all this sort of assassination idea, where she sang the song Queen of the Night. So she's the queen with the JFK assassination. She's found dead in a bathtub. She's connected to J. Ray. You see all this sort of weird stuff flying around her. And did you know that there was a story that Osama bin Laden was obsessed with Whitney Houston and tried to have her husband killed so he could have Whitney Houston as his wife? So
Wow, I
yeah,
did not know that.
Yeah, so it's like crazy. Like that, like all these things are kind of oddly connected. And now, we focus on these examples from both pop culture or politics or whatever from the world stage, and it gets, people say, well, it's easy to see why the Illuminati or somebody would want to control the world stage. This is why, again, I bring it back to say you have to pay attention to your personal synchronicities. Otherwise, all this stuff just seems like too crazy. But when you realize that the same thing happens in your own life, and the way you can see that everything's connected in your own life, it really just does put things into perspective. This doesn't have to be some crazy ritual to kill Whitney Houston because I don't even know, however that benefits Mr. Burns in his castle somewhere. I don't see how that really benefits him. But, it's possible. People pointed out that Whitney Houston had at her funeral, she had these two Egyptian sarcophagus, sort of like as the twin pillars at the entranceway to her funeral. There's these two pillars that you have to pass through to get into her wake, which is really bizarre. So, like, is there a ritual aspect, or is there, you have to bear in mind a sort of Egyptian Afrocentric chic that, particularly in the 80s when she was big, there was a connection between African Americans and understanding their Egyptian roots, which still carries to this day. So, like, people were like, why would this Baptist woman have an Egyptian imagery at her funeral? Obviously, it's because some Masonic blah, blah, blah. Come on. That's not necessarily the answer. Again, like, the fact that she's a black woman having Egyptian imagery at her funeral could be a reflection of an Egyptian Afrocentric thing that was, like I said, particularly rose popularity during the 80s when she was into all this stuff. So to me, that's all very possible, but yet it's still connected. It's just hard for me, like when I bring up these examples from pop culture or from politics, people just assume that these are manipulated events. I could sit here and I could talk for 2 hours about my personal synchronicities. You might not find them as interesting because you might not know when I say, oh, and then my friend Joe, you'd be like, all right, I don't know who you're talking about. It's not really that interesting. If I say Osama bin Laden, you have some context there. So that's why this is why people a lot of the synchromystics use movies as their examples, is because most people have seen, whatever the number one movie at the box office is, they've all seen it, and then okay, I know what you're talking about. Or if I talk about, 9/11, you know what I'm talking about. But we reach these areas where people assume if it's something on the world stage that therefore it's manipulated. And I keep using the expression world stage for a reason. It's like, yes, there are manipulated events, and yet it's also a world stage in the sense of Plato's cave, this idea that, we're sort of watching these events, assuming them all to be external, assuming them all to be one thing, and never fully understanding what they truly mean or what they truly are. We're only ever seeing part of it. And so hopefully what we're doing by studying synchronicity and adding this into our sort of kaleidoscopic lens here, by adding that in, what we do is maybe we get a better appreciation of what it really means. But I was just going to say, even still, I think we're always still hinting at it, if that makes sense. Like, I can't point to and say, there's the answer, there's the source, there's the ultimate truth. All I can ever do, what any of these things can do, is kind of hint and point at it. But that's something that you can never really spell out in words or even in images or anything like that.
So essentially, we're having collective synchronicities, but if we don't even realize the personal synchronicities in our own lives, it's hard to understand the collective synchronicities that we all experience.
Correct. Absolutely, yes.
Fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I make one more point about the
Please,
Olympics?
yes.
I just think there's really something interesting at the Olympics that I haven't heard anybody else mention, as to what it means. I'll leave that open for interpretation. But I think it's really interesting that everyone's made the connection that the 2012 Olympics, that the logo seems to spell Zion, and all the roads around the Olympic fields are all have these biblical names. So people like to point this out and think that this is some sort of Zionist plot, possibly, or just whatever interpretation people stick on that. What I just want to sort of throw out there is I think it's really interesting that we're going into an election. Obviously the Olympics coincide 4-year Olympics, 4-year presidential election cycle, so there's always a sort of correlation with the presidency. But we have Barack Obama going up against Mitt Romney, who is a Mormon, which Mormons believe in the American Zion, and what's really interesting is that Mitt Romney is most famous for saving the Salt Lake City Olympics. So Mitt Romney has this really strong Olympic connection. I think he wrote a book, or someone else wrote a book about him and the Salt Lake City Olympics. If you look into Mitt Romney at all, that's his biggest sort of claim to fame as the guy who, quote unquote, saved the Salt Lake City Olympics. Salt Lake City, Utah, of course, a very big Mormon town. And in Utah, which is a really heavy Mormon state, and I don't mean to put like a, ooh, Mormons. I hope people understand that. Just saying, we can carry this sort of connection. There's actually a national park in Utah called Zion National Park. I've been there. It's actually really beautiful. But you have Zion in Utah, and you have all these Mormons who see America as the true Zion. And so his connection between the Olympics and that he's running for president during the time when we're looking at a 2012 Zion Olympics, I think is fascinating.
Alan, also, they've got this opening ceremony that's got a Jerusalem theme.
Yes,
which is a very, very much sort of an unofficial national anthem, Jerusalem in the UK. It's just amazing. Do you know about Rick Clay?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I know that he did that interview, 4-hour interview on August 28th with Red Ice. And he's the one that really broke open the huge amount of symbology about the Olympics. And then he did commit suicide, but that was on the 11th of September in 2008. I mean, it gets weirder and weirder. Do you have any thoughts about all of this? What's your take on all of it? I mean, I'm to the point now where when I think of the Olympics, I think of the alien meme.
Oh, that's interesting.
It's just crazy.
Okay, so a few points there. The whole Zion Jerusalem Olympics shtick. Bear in mind that their opening ceremony is also playing up on what's they've recreated Glastonbury as part of the set. Well, Glastonbury is where King Arthur was supposed to be buried, waiting to come back. So you have your sort of death of the king, rebirth of the king, very much tied into this in their opening ceremony. So that's definitely there. Rick Clay, I mean, obviously, so if he did commit suicide, or whether or not that's actually what happened, that's interesting, because then you would assume that he intentionally did that. But I just James Shelby Downward, the guy who I was talking about before, who did all the essentially synchronicity research around JFK, he was born on like March 13th or 14th and died on March 16th, I believe it is. So, he didn't commit suicide. He wasn't killed. He died. He was an older gentleman. But think about it. His birthday is like straddling the Ides of March, completely connected with the death of the king.
Absolutely.
So, you know, he didn't choose when he was born and didn't choose when he was died, yet he still resonates with this, that his work with the king kill, but that's what he's most famous for, is the work with the king kill, and his birth and death are intimately resonating with this. So that's fascinating, you know, like that he didn't, you wouldn't have planned that, you couldn't have planned that, and yet it happened. So Rick Clay, I guess, again, it's a gray area. It's very questionable.
Yeah.
Whatever the circumstances around his death, we could throw a lot of questions on it. But the fact that it was 9/11, again, did he do that on purpose, or is this just a further resonating with the work that he's, is what he's most known for? Basically, like,
Right.
is your life's work basically, are you controlled by what you choose to study? I mean, this is when I said, like, someone asked before, what was the ultimate value of synchromysticism? And I said, because once you realize what you find so important, like what has meaning to you, then you learn something about yourself. So the fact that James Shelby Downard was fascinated by the king kill, and he seemed to resonate in his personal life. The fact that Rick Clay was fascinated with all this symbolism and probably seemed to resonate within his life. Again, it's like you get a sort of insight into both your intentional interests and your unintentional, whether that be subconscious or a higher answer that you're just resonating with this through your astrological natal chart, whatever answer you want to put on that. So it's what the actual explanation is, but it's really interesting. Now your last point. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, about the aliens. I was going to remind you.
Yeah. So about the aliens. So again, it doesn't have to be literal. What we have right now is we have this Baltic Sea anomaly that people have paid attention to. And then there was just last week this news that came out about British Atlantis found, where they found they think was all this territory that used to be underwater, part of a wider sort of British territory. And so this sort of connection, the same way we said about Cliff High's thing with the water and space being a sort of interchangeable metaphors. Well, water is also, a metaphor for the unconscious. This is very common. In Jungian archetypes, we say that the underwater is your subconscious. So ultimately, we could see this sort of contact with the other, or with the sort of forgotten neighbor, or however, whatever phrasing we want to put on this, it could resonate exactly the same thing. So we don't, everyone's probably waiting for like aliens to land in the middle of the Olympic Stadium and go like, we come in peace or blow us up or whatever. I don't think you're going to see UFOs land in the middle of the Olympic Stadium. All you really need to satisfy what everyone's sort of feeling in their gut would be exactly this type of discovery.
So,
does that make sense?
In other words, yes. And so, in other words, the alien we will meet in ourselves is our own unconscious.
Exactly. See, thank you. Yeah, that's the next step. It's like to on the 3D level, we're all waiting to meet the alien at the Olympics. Well, we could have already met the alien at the Olympics. It could just be the sort of forgotten city or something like that. The basically the Atlanteans, around the Olympics. That could be it on a 3D level. Yeah, when you take it to that next level of what is the personal reflection, what does this mean on a wider scale for all of us? Exactly. Yeah, the alien other. Is the alien other a literal alien other, or is it untapped DNA, or is it an aspect of higher consciousness or collective consciousness? What is the alien other, and how is it actually not really alien or other?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
I'll give you guys a I don't know how pressed for time, let me know, but I'll give you a real quick story.
Please.
I had the craziest dream and then experience the other day when I told you I was talking to this guy, Will Morgan, about it. And he said, did you think it was actual contact, or was it a metaphor for something internal? And I said, both. What essentially happened is I have this dream where there's some sort of weird, like, almost like party slash like zoo. There's like giraffes and zebras. Like there's like a bunch of like exotic animals and people all on this like big piece of territory, and I'm sort of there, and sometimes in a dream you like know essentially like the plot of the dream, if you know what
Yeah.
I mean. So it's like I somehow know that I'm there and that there are these two twin children that are going to die at this party, and I'm looking for the children to save them. And um, as I'm looking for them, I see what was like a kangaroo or something like jump and like crush this small child, and it was like a devastating thing to see. And I'm like, oh my god, and just like I couldn't save the kid, and I sort of like walk away, and I'm walking across the field, and there's like this building there, and I just go into this building, and I enter this room, and it was this really weird room, like kind of like 2001: A Space Odyssey, like it's all white walls, but it was like a mix between that and like Twin Peaks. It was like really bizarre, like weird energy in this room, and there's these two blue people sitting in there, and I go into this room and I see these really weird blue people, and I'm like, okay, like I say to them, I said, oh, I'm sorry, I think I went into the wrong room, excuse me, I'll just back up now. And they're like, no, 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 we invited you here. And they said, this is our like our place, our like I don't know if they said our estate or our, this was our thing, we invited you here. And I have to admit, so at first I'm thinking like, well, okay, I just saw these two kids die. Like when they say this is our thing, did they want the like? I start like I guess my mind leapt to like, were these sacrifices? And that the thought crosses my mind, and instantly I think to myself, you know, this is so strange that I'm projecting a lot of fear. Let me turn off my fear for a moment and sit down. So I sit down, and there's this blue woman who has almost like a peacock face and a peacock head, and this blue man, like really dark blue skin, and he keeps rubbing his right temple, which I think is really fascinating, considering like a sort of right lobe of our brain.
Yes.
And he keeps rubbing his right temple the way like someone might like if they have like an itch in their ear or like water in their ear from swimming. They kind of like really like, and he keeps like rubbing his right temple while he's talking to me, and he says, no, we invited you here. And I couldn't remember the name that he said, but I remembered it later in the day, so I'll just tell you. He says, we're, we're the people that were in Britain before the British. We're the Hectites. And so I ended up getting woken up at this point, and I had to go. My wife wakes me up. We were supposed to take. I had made plans that like my mother had taken the day off from work. She wanted to take my niece to this like public swimming pool in here in I live in Queens, New York, and she said we're not too far from my house. She was going to this pool, and she said, hey, do you want to come with us? So I said, okay. My wife wakes me up. She's like, hey, we got to start getting ready, to go meet your mom and your niece. So I said, okay, I just have this sort of daily ritual of like, particularly if I have like a weird dream, I just need to like kind of check the headlines real quick before I leave the house. Like, and particularly after this weird dream. And the first thing I see is this headline, British Atlantis found. And I go, oh my God. Because in this dream, they're saying, we're the ones that were there before the British. I was, what the hell? So and then my wife's like, hurry up, we got to go. Okay, go. So I'm in the swimming pool, and all day I'm trying to remember what was the name that these people said. Because I remember they said we are the something. I'm like, what was that? What was that?
Yeah.
And I'm in this pool for a few hours, and then as I'm leaving the pool, suddenly the name pops in my mind: Hectites. Okay, I'll go home and I'll check it out.
What does it
Well,
mean?
well, I've only, I've been really busy. I mean, even as important as this is, I've only been able to do a small amount of research into it. It's only happened a few days ago, and I can only find a few sources for the word Hectite, but it seems to be some sort of like kind of druid-like magicians related to this triple goddess, Hecate. And I look into this goddess, and she's fascinating because she said, she's this goddess of the triple crossroads, specifically triple crossroads, and traveling in the underworld. And then I learned that her mother, mythological mother, is Asteria. Well, check this out. I spent the day in this swimming pool, which is in Astoria Park. It's just changing the O to the E. I spent the entire day in Astoria Pool, which brings us back to the alchemical pool of where the ego dies, and swimming in the unconscious and all that sort of stuff. I'm literally in Astoria. I'm in the goddess Asteria pool, and if you can confirm this on a simple like Google Maps or something like that, the swimming pool is actually located on the shore between two bridges where you can see them like really large looming over the pool. One is called the Hell's Gate Bridge, and the other is the Triborough Bridge. It's actually a bridge that connects Queens, Bronx, and Manhattan. So she's the goddess of the triple crossroads and the entranceway to the underworld. So I'm at the Hell's Gate and the Triborough Bridge in Asteria or Astoria Pool. I mean, this is the kind of thing where he's just ultimately, Will asks me, what do you think? Was it a contact or a sort of higher consciousness? And I said, I really feel both.
Yeah.
And what's interesting, the reason he was so interested was that he said he had a very similar dream years earlier, and it also involved a blue peacock woman and all this stuff with the twins. And he said that he's been really that dream stayed with him for many years, and he sees it as the twin strands of DNA. And basically this sort of like, we can take the underworld as the unconscious realm and all this sort of stuff. And his thing was that the twin children died. Someone asked here, did any children die? No, I'll tell you, I spent the whole day at that pool looking all around me. I'm like, all right, so far I got the British Atlantis is found. I don't want to find two dead children. So I actually spent the whole day at the pool, like really like a eagle-eyed, like gotta look out to see if I need to save any children today. But his thing was that the two dead children in the dream are the same. The blue people are the dead children. And his meaning for it was that, and he said he's come to this after many years, is that the two children dying is to show that there's a physical world where mortality still exists. That you can die here, and then you go into the other realm where they're still there, and this is the sort of like eternal. When we say underworld has some pretty dark connotations for a lot of people, but to say subconscious realms, underworld. I spoke to someone, it's like fairy realm. We could take this as, through fairy lore or all this sort of stuff. But basically, this is the sort of outside of time realm where they can't die, and that he said they were actually the same. They were the same too. Really interesting. It's just the overlap between his dream and my own is really fascinating. But it's like really fresh experience. So it's hard to say, but ultimately it was so specific with this one goddess that I was like, well, it's so specific to her that I feel like this isn't just, I don't know, like, it's like, so is it like she's saying, hey, I'm over here, pay attention, or is it my, activating something in a higher consciousness? And I just really feel so sure in my answer that it's somehow both.
Well, maybe that's why there's two children in there too.
Yeah.
Quite fascinating. Oh, thank you for sharing that with us. And that sounds like one of those dreams you keep unpacking for years.
Yeah, exactly.
Kaleidoscoping out, as you would say.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for that.
No, thank you.
Alan, this is Gemini, and we wanted to touch on the Norway spiral and the Baltic Sea anomaly, but I'm wondering how you're doing on time.
I'm okay. I mean, I don't know what you guys, if you have a time limit, let me know.
I think we're all good here. We just don't want to hog you.
No, I'm okay.
Okay. Well, Alan, one of our forum members, Bobby or Nine, was interested in how the Norway spiral captivated so many and yet continues to be mysterious in spite of the official explanations. And more recently, we have the Baltic Sea anomaly that has been in the news shrouded in mystery. What are your thoughts on the connections between these two events?
Okay. For me, the Norway spiral is absolutely enormous, and it is key to this. And that's why I said before, it it's a little hard to explain concisely, but the Norway spiral for me is ultimately connected to this Catherine wheel on an archetypal level. If you study the Catherine wheel and how it sort of seems to pop up and all this stuff, then it'll sort of make a little. If someone's really interested in the archetypes, I would suggest going that way. As far as like synchronicities, you have something that I think is so fascinating. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the work of Freeman, just like Freeman perspective, but he had been studying this thing called I think it was called CARE, CARE was the acronym, and it was like basically this like studies where they emit particles into the atmosphere to study how particles disperse. So they actually go ahead and like emit these sort of like particles from rockets, and NASA was doing it. And he had been studying this right around the time just before the Norway spiral. Um, now, I should feel silly. I don't know the exact scientific term. If you give me a second, but aluminum oxide. Okay. So Freeman had been doing this research into that these particles that were being emitted that were aluminum oxide particles. And so when the Norway spiral happens and he sees it's this bright blue color, he looks into it. And what, if you know anything, sapphires, the actual content of a sapphire is aluminum oxide. So what he realized was that possibly the Norway spiral, if it was this aluminum oxide rocket, could have been made of sapphires. Now, that was huge for me because I was having all these synchronicities with sapphires. And the Norway spiral just continues to this day to be a huge sort of touchstone in my own research and my own personal development and everything. So it's really important to me. But what's fascinating is if you look at the royal wedding, Princess Diana had from Prince Charles was given a sapphire ring, and then when William and Kate get married, she has that same ring. It's this sapphire ring. So it was like on the newspaper, all these front page newspapers going like, "Oh, the new." It was funny. The headline was "The New Diana," and they're showing her engagement ring as this big sapphire ring. Now, we could take this a whole number of ways. Mythologically, of course, Diana is the moon. We can see that her name, she's Princess Catherine. She is with the sapphire, your Catherine wheel. So that's really interesting. The sapphire lapis lazuli was this Egyptian idea of this, what they called a sapphire that might not have actually been the same compound. It was what they called sapphire, and this is was to them like Cleopatra's like blue eye makeup. This is very much a symbol of royalty, or it can be, but it obviously goes bigger than that. We see, when we're dreaming about blue people, and we could take that to a sort of Krishna or anything like that. I should add that with the Norway spiral, most people are probably familiar, if they're aware of the Norway spiral, the connection between the Norway spiral and Barack Obama in Oslo. His Nobel Peace Prize was acceptance was the following day in Oslo. Christopher Knowles from The Secret Sun actually found that during his Oslo speech, there's like a mural behind him which actually shows blue people. It looks very much like an Egyptian image of like these sort of layers. If you've ever seen like images of like Egyptian life, and they show like people working, in the field, and then there's sort of like the kings above them and the gods above them. Very, very similar looking thing, and but there's blue people at the top. So that's really interesting as well. So Obama takes his sort of Nobel Peace Prize, which is, just to interject for a moment, we all know highly ironic for a mass murderer to get a Nobel Peace Prize, but nonetheless, it still sinks. Um, so you have this weird, like, hey, here's a Norway spiral, here's Barack Obama getting this really ironic Peace Prize, and he's standing in front of a statue with blue people in it. What a lot of people don't, and there's a specific detail about the Norway spiral that I have a really hard time people getting to take interest in, I'm guessing because of the assumed religious connotations, but I don't see why we have to take it at religious face value. There was in Egypt, the day before the Norway spiral, there was all these Coptic, this is basically Christian Egyptians, had this witnessed this giant Virgin Mary appearance in the sky, what they called this blue and white Mary apparition. Yeah, thank you. And essentially we see this. People go, oh, well, I don't believe in the Virgin Mary. Okay, I don't, disregard that. Excuse me, if there's a big blue light in the sky in Egypt, and then there's a big blue light in the sky over Norway, or as it's actually more likely is over the Russian Peninsula. Regardless, big blue lights in the sky we should pay attention to if they're connected. But for some reason, no, I can't get people to pay attention to this Marian apparition in Egypt. But I think it's an interesting connection there. So regardless, we have this Oslo Norway spiral connection that it just seemed so intertwined. I think someone asked why if we have an official explanation, why isn't that enough? Well, obviously we're all into alternative research where the official explanation is never enough. But there's also the idea that even the official explanation makes no sense. You're telling me the American president is in Europe to accept a Nobel Peace Prize, and you're Russia launching rockets over him? Like, that's your official explanation? Makes no sense. Yeah, well, in the middle of a Peace Prize ceremony, we're just going to launch some rockets. That actually makes no sense whatsoever. So there's probably a bigger political intrigue that goes on there. But nonetheless, it's just a really fascinating timing, and there was something just seemed really, it's hard to put your finger on. I think for most, I've spoken to a lot of people at the Norway Spiral. It's really hard to put your finger on, but just something about it seemed important. I think on a gut level, like the way when I said, like, everyone kind of disregarded the Osama bin Laden story, and yet it somehow seemed important. I knew that this was somehow tied into all this. With the Norway Spiral, just really kind of huge. And no one could kind of explain why. Besides the fact that it just looked really bizarre, there was something really intuitively important about it. Now, as to how the Norway Spiral connects to this Baltic anomaly, I don't know if you've seen, I put something on my blog recently. Basically, I had this weird, I wasn't really following the Baltic anomaly story. I saw someone mention it, okay, it was like, just sort of didn't do anything for me. And then, like a few days later, or even a few weeks later, suddenly it just like something clicked in my mind. And I realized that if you look, there's a guy, his name is, I think it's like spellcomputing.com, SPELL, computing or consulting. Just look up like Norway Spiral Tony Spell. He does a really interesting breakdown that he thinks he can locate the actual Norway Spiral over a Russian peninsula. It was a really interesting research that he did. So I took his maps and drew a line between Oslo, where Barack Obama was, and where Tony Spell locates the Norway Spiral. and obviously they are crossing the Baltic Sea. But that's a pretty big area, and I just felt like there was a weird connection there, though. So I said, well, maybe, like, wouldn't it be interesting? And there's no way to confirm it, but wouldn't it be interesting if it's actually like crossing over this dot, like literally like connecting dots. So I started playing with just like that idea. Now, check this out though. So I draw this line on a map and I put this on my blog and say there seems to be a connection here. Then a commenter tells me, have you seen anything about this Israel spiral? And Israel spiral, I guess I should confirm it. I believe it was July 7th, if I'm not mistaken. If you give me a second, I can confirm that. But I believe it was July 7th. And sorry, June 7th, excuse me. June 7th is the date of the Israel spiral. I hope I have that right. I'm pretty sure it was June 7th. Well, that's the exact same day that the divers from OceanX went down to the Baltic anomaly. The same day that they go down to the anomaly is the day of this Israel spiral, which looks exactly the same in the news reports. It's interesting. You see the news reports about it, and they go, "Oh, a similar type spiral appeared over Norway." It's like everyone's making the connection. Okay, Israel spiral, Norway spiral. And what people don't realize is the exact same day as the divers went down that this spiral appears over Israel. And I could take it a step further. The line that I connected from Oslo to Tony Spell's location of the Norway spiral, if you draw it backwards, so instead of going from Oslo to the Norway spiral, go from the Norway spiral through Oslo into the United Kingdom, you actually hit the exact point that day on June 7th where the Olympic torch was. Right now they're doing the Olympic torch, different, running it around different countries. If you follow that line, the Olympic torch is perfectly in line. Olympic torch, Oslo, Norway spiral, perfect line, okay,
Wow.
on the map. So there seems to be a really strong correlation here. Norway spiral, Olympics, Baltic Sea anomaly. Again, is this tied in with this sort of Atlantis? We talked before about this goddess, this triple goddess, Hecate. She's actually part of her symbolism is the torch. So I think that's really interesting that I sort of had this dream around then, and tying in with all this stuff, that the torch lines up. But it could, of course, be something planned. Someone writes here, isn't the Catherine wheel a torture device and it's a firework? It's actually all of these things. The name comes from a torture device where they took these wheels and they actually either strapped someone to these wheels and beat them while they were on the wheel, or they would actually take the wheels and beat people with big wagon wheels, essentially. And then there's this Catholic mythology that says Saint Catherine. Oh yeah, there we go. So, this Bluebell knows the story. So Saint Catherine apparently is going to be tortured because of her professed faith in Jesus, and they go to put her on the Catherine wheel, and she touches, at that point it was just called the breaking wheel, actually, and she goes to touch it, and the wheel shatters into a million pieces, and so they can't do it. But, then they just cut her head off. She wasn't saved from decapitation, but nonetheless, we get this symbolism of the wheel gets named after her, that she essentially is this martyr. But the Catherine wheel can go a number of ways. So you have the spoked wheel, but and you see like a lot of churches will do what are basically mandalas, these sort of stained glass windows, but they call those Catherine wheels as well. It's sort of this radiating, almost snowflake or round stained glass window shape. They call those Catherine wheels. And then there's fireworks where they spin basically the way look very similar to the Norway spiral. I would like to point out that we can also, Ferris wheels are also Catherine wheels. So when you consider that what did they put up at for the quote unquote millennium in London, but the London Eye, which is basically a giant Catherine wheel or Ferris wheel. So that's that's of course them marking the wheel of time. But I thought it was interesting on the night of the British royal wedding. I'm pretty sure they lit up the London Eye blue. So you have connecting again to the blue lights. If anyone's seen and here in New York, after the towers fell, every year on September 11th, they put up these giant lights where the towers used to be. They're not white lights, they're blue lights. So they're sending these two blue beams into the sky every 9/11 to remember 9/11. They're lighting up the London Eye blue for the royal wedding. There's the the Norway spiral, this big blue spiral. There's something to this blue light. Obviously, there's the connection to. Sorry, just someone mentioned Doctor Who. If you're interested in Doctor Who, there's a. I'll try and find it for you later. There's a Jake Coates video where he connected the London Eye to Doctor Who as some sort of weird like Stargate type thing. Really interesting. I've actually never seen that show, but he did it that video. But obviously, most people are going to take this to a blue light. We're going to connect to the blue beam. Everyone knows Project Blue Beam. There, obviously seems to be some crossover there. There's definitely, again, we're reaching out to the alien other, or are we simulating contact with the alien other? I think is really interesting. I'm going to tell you something, kind of bring it back to what we talked about earlier. We're going to talk about, blue beam, aliens connected to all of this. So James Shelby Downard shows the connection between the first atomic explosion, the Trinity site, and the JFK assassination. And they're both on the 33rd degree parallel. They're actually, Trinity site is like 33.6 and Dealey Plaza is like 32.7, but pretty damn close. They're within 1 degree of each other, pretty damn close. What he doesn't realize is that the Nagasaki bombing, there's a marker in Japan that marks what they call the hypocenter, the exact point of the Nagasaki atomic explosion is almost exact with Dealey Plaza. And the Nagasaki bombing was only like the 3rd or 4th atomic explosion in history. So you have those, that's also taking place, but actually even closer than the Trinity site is the Nagasaki site. I have the numbers here somewhere if someone was really interested. Dealey Plaza is 32.77. Sorry, Nagasaki is 32.773, and Dealey Plaza is 32.778. Incredibly close, Nagasaki connection. So when I realized, okay, this makes sense. We talked about how JFK is connected with Osiris, who was, of course, dismembered into 14 pieces. And we also have, people have made the joke, the splitting of the atom. Well, there's the biblical story of the splitting of Adam, right? You take Adam's rib. What happens is that biblically, if we realize that this archetype, biblically, the split of Adam creates the feminine principle. And this is the reason why I keep coming back to why we see Catherine wheels as the feminine, sacred feminine, is you're always going to have that feminine principle there. And to me, this is what it represents. So the splitting of the atom archetypally represents the creation of the feminine principle. What we did in U.S. history, after testing at White Sands, New Mexico, we then go on to Operation Crossroads, which again brings in our crossroads. And then we started doing atomic testing at the Bikini Islands. And if anyone knows, the actual swimsuit bikini is so named after these atomic tests in the Bikini Islands. So again, splitting of atom, feminine principle are highly connected. Anyway, as I saw that, okay, Downard's correct. There's a correlation between JFK and this sort of splitting man. If anyone knows any Kabbalah, this is also Adam Kadmon. The Kabbalists take it a step further. Instead of just Adam having his rib removed, it's sort of he's broken into many pieces, and the idea is that Kabbalists and actually all of humanity are sort of reassembling Adam Kadmon. So we could take it there as well. But once I realized that there's this really strong connection between the atomic bombs and the JFK assassination, I decided to do a little research and see if this correlation continues. I knew that the U.S. continued testing atomic weapons throughout the 60s and 70s, and I decided to see if there was an atomic bomb test the day of JFK's assassination. Well, guess what? There was. It occurred an hour after JFK's assassination, which I actually think is really interesting, considering you would almost think if the U.S. president was killed, the military would be probably more on alert, or probably halt their tests and probably have bigger things on their mind than testing. This was there like at that point I think 360 something atomic tests. It's not like they we're still really trying to figure out, how to split an atom. So you feel like they could have postponed that test. Pretty interesting. But what's all more interesting is that each of these atomic tests have a code name, and some of them are pretty weird names. This one that goes off an hour after JFK is killed is called Operation Grays. Plural, Greys. Operation Grays is the atomic test that goes off an hour after JFK is shot. I should point out that a few hours before JFK is shot, Aldous Huxley, famous Aldous Huxley from Brave New World, and The Doors of Perception, the man who advocated psychedelic use, the man who opened the doors of the perception. Aldous Huxley died the same day as JFK, and as he's on his deathbed, he asks his wife to give him an injection of LSD so that he can, have one last trip before he goes to sort of prepare him for death. So Aldous Huxley is on his final, LSD trip during all this. So you have the idea of this correlation between blowing your mind, is the expression blowing your mind, JFK getting his brains blown out, and then this atomic explosion that resonates with aliens, Operation Grays, the alien other, and then we have to realize that a mushroom, like the atomic bomb creates what's called a mushroom cloud. So you have, again, the psychedelic connection. I would like to, I'd be silly if I didn't point out that the actual discovery of LSD and the development of the technology to split the atom were essentially discovered in tandem. Okay, you can look into this, that basically the discovery of the LSD and the discovery of the atomic bomb happened at the same time. So, some people have compared that it's almost like every reaction has an equal and opposite reaction. It's sort of like, here's the explosive outward explosion of the atomic bomb, and here's the explosive inward journey of psychedelics, both happening in history at the exact same moment. The fact that all of this revolves around, that we see all of this happen as the JFK, the king, is killed, tells me that we're really, really talking about an ego death experience on a wider scale.
That's really fascinating. Wow. Thank you for covering all that. Alan, wow, we've really enjoyed our conversation with you this evening, and I was wondering if there's anything that we didn't cover that you would like to discuss.
No, I don't know. This was awesome. I guess I would be silly not to point out that let's just see. I did. Okay, I wanted to mention the Muse thing. Yeah, that's awesome. I had like barely any notes, but there was just a few. I wanted to mention that Muse thing because it seems a really interesting little note that that I thought was really just, I don't know. It's like really puts a big question mark on it for me, and I think it's really raises the good question of like, if an artist is trying to bring attention to something, how do we treat them, and so on and so on. with that in mind, I guess I should say we have, after doing the Sync book last year, the book has continued to do fairly well. We have decided to do a second volume. So we're looking, I can't guarantee it, but we are looking to have this book out for December 21st, 2012.
The second edition of the Sync book?
Second volume of the Sync book, yeah. Now, what was important, so just to say what was important to me is in doing the first volume, the reason I have 26 authors was to get a lot of different perspectives. And I didn't want to just rehash that stuff. So it was important to me to, like, a few people asked me to do it, and I was like, well, I would only do it if we could kind of do something a little different, or sort of that it's adding to it. I don't, as as a guy who sees so many people talking about movies, even though I'm not a huge movie person, that I see so many people talking about movies, but I didn't want to make a bad sequel, So,
right.
So it was important to me. So I said, okay, let's make it basically an addition, like you're just another volume of this, and so we'd have all new authors for this. As it stands right now, I have 22 confirmed authors. I'm looking to do 26 again, and I'm just waiting to hear back from a few more people. But I have some names you might know, like Anthony Peake, Sonia Barrett, Trish and Rob McGregor, Mike Cleland, who studies how UFOs and synchronicity overlap, John Cale from Cosmic Gnostic, Freeman from Freeman Perspective, Frater X, who does Middle Chamber, David Plate. I mean, I could keep going. William Klaus, a lot of Scott Onstott, who does a lot of, showing. He's done a lot of work with the London Olympics, also showing actual distances and connecting sacred geometry beyond sacred sites, showing that there's a real geometry being played out on the map here, both intentional and unintentional. I really like his work. We have John Cale from Cosmic Gnostic, and a ton of just really great people. Paul Levy from Awaken in the Dream. I think you just had on your show, or you're going to have on your show?
Yeah, we sure did. We just had him on.
Yeah, he's going to be in Sync Book 2. I just spoke to him a few days ago. I know you're going to have Neil Kramer on soon.
Yes, again, yes.
Yeah, he was in the first Sync Book. So just to say, I'm really excited. We're doing. I'm kind of doing a lot at once, but we're just sort of really rolling with trying to crack this egg, try and explore this stuff from every perspective. So it's really important to me that I personally feel really blessed and honored that I've been given this opportunity to talk on a subject I'm passionate about and to help bring these things to wider attention. With that in mind, I want to make sure that I keep highlighting other people's work. And that's why I'm doing the Sync book, and I did the Sync book and doing Sync book 2. And I really encourage everyone, if you go to thesyncbook.com, that's SYNC, thesyncbook.com, just click on authors. You're going to see links to the first 26 authors, the authors from the first Sync book. I'll be updating that soon with links to the authors from Sync book 2. You can see we've got radio shows there, other interviews, and also other books. We put out, since the Sync book, we've put out a book from Andros Jones. It's called Accidental Initiations in the Kabbalistic Tree of Olympia, where he found, in his hometown of Olympia, Washington, he found a Kabbalistic tree built into the structure of the town, obviously very intentionally. But he's, instead of taking it as oh my God, Freemasons put this thing here, he's saying, I just love what he does. He starts the book off with saying, yeah, all we know is they put it here. Obviously, there's a sign at one, you can't really tell, most people can't tell, but there's one part of it that's marked, with a Masonic statue that says this was put here by the Freemasons, and it's obviously the Freemasons put it here, but he sort of just addresses that on one page. Okay, Freemasons put it here. Instead of looking at the conspiracy behind it, let's just look at how he's lived here his whole town, and all the synchronicities he's had with this thing that he never even realized was there, and what it's meant to him, and how different parts of his life played out with how this tree seems to be laid out. And so instead of taking it from a fear-based perspective, he's just taking it from like a very objective, just just really taking it as, hey, this is what it is, and these are the experiences I've had. Isn't this interesting? And ultimately, that's the kind of viewpoint I really like to highlight, is people saying, instead of saying, I know what this is and I'm going to tell you, say, hey, this is what happened to me, and let's explore, and what do you think of it? This is what I think, what do you think? So that's really important to me. So I'm really proud of him for that book. There's also, we did a book from Douglas Bowles called Winter's Labyrinth. And we are working with Frater X, who is a Mason. He's doing a book called The Secret War Inside Freemasonry, and he's showing how what he views as the true Masonic tradition was basically co-opted by Scottish Rite Masonry, and sort of perverted, and how showing how things were changed, and that since there's like, basically he's describing it as basically like Jedi Sith type story. It's like, here's people studying something, and then here's people coming along and trying to pervert it. So he's doing The Secret War Inside Freemasonry. We're going to be putting that out from Sync Book Press, and just a ton of great works in the coming down the pipeline.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of information is out there for people to tap into to learn all about these amazing synchronicities and connections. Now, when is your 9/11 and JFK assassination bin Laden book going to be out?
I can't guarantee. I'm hoping that it comes out the end of this year, but I'm sort of burning my candle at, like, some people burn their candle at both ends. I sort of just like throw it into the boiling pot.
Right.
And
Does it have an official name?
It's called Suicide Kings.
Suicide Kings. That's right. Okay, I did read that.
And I'm trying for the end of the year. If it's not the end of this year, it'll be the beginning of next year. It'll be soon. I want to do it right, and I'm trying to. My thing is, I put out Sync Book 1 on September 11th, as a sort of marking where we've come in 10 years since. Okay. I'm trying to put this Sync Book 2 out for December 21st, 2012, to sort of play with that date. I'm not a high occultist doing a high ritual here. If I don't make that date, I'm not going to sweat it, But it's more important to me that you guys get a really good book and it's done right, is sort of my point. So definitely, like I said, end of this year or very beginning of next year. But I'm reluctant to give an exact date for that book.
Wonderful. And, I really enjoyed the Sync book, and I'm hoping that when the second book is published, that you would enjoy coming back on and talking about that book, because we'd sure love having you on again.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I appreciate the offer, and I'd be happy to.
Well, thanks so much for joining us this evening, Alan. It's been great fun for all of us.
Oh, same here. I really appreciate everything, and you guys have been wonderful, great points, and it's, as I said, it's something for me that I never know if I'm, as I just sort of write in a room by myself, I never know, is someone going to know what I'm talking about here? But you guys are giving me a lot of encouragement here, that these ideas are, you sort of get where I'm going with this sort of stuff, and you see the importance in it. And it's just, for a guy who does a lot of, writing a very solitary experience. And at this point, my wife's tired of hearing about it. So, I appreciate the sort of, understanding that you guys gave. It's really, really encouraging, and I appreciate it very much.
It was a pleasure talking with you, Alan. Thank you for coming on to Time on Radio.
Very, very inspiring and interesting and fascinating. And thanks for the chat. It's great.
Absolutely. Thank you, guys. I'll talk to you soon. I'll let you know when the I said Sync Book 2 definitely end of this year, and I'll let you know about the other one.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
All right, guys. Have a great night.
You too.
You
Night.
too, Alan.
Good night.
Bye.